For most of us today, death is seen as an ending, a final curtain drawn on the story of life. But for the ancient Egyptians, death was only the beginning of a much longer, and often far more dangerous, journey. To them, the grave was not a place of silence but a threshold. Beyond it stretched a perilous road into the afterlife, filled with traps, gods, and trials that could determine whether the soul achieved eternal bliss, or was devoured forever. And it was here, in this space between life and death, that some of Egypt's strangest rituals took shape. The Egyptians lived in constant awareness of mortality. Every flood of the Nile, every harvest, every change of season reminded them of the cycle of death and rebirth. But their fascination with death wasn't born from despair, it came from hope. They believed that through precise rituals, carefully guarded spells, and the protection of the gods, death could be defeated. The deceased could live again, not in a vague spiritual sense, but as a being with all the senses, pleasures, and comforts of earthly life. The only catch? The living had to perform elaborate, and sometimes disturbing, ceremonies to make it happen. Perhaps the most famous of these was the opening of the mouth ceremony. To our modern eyes, it was a haunting performance. Picture this, a lifeless mummy, wrapped tightly in linen, lying still in the burial chamber. Priests, clad in leopard skins or pure white linen, circled the body with ritual tools in hand. In their chants, they invoked the gods, calling upon Horus, Anubis, and Thoth to witness what was about to unfold. Then came the climax. The priest approached the corpse and touched the mouth, the eyes, and the ears with a ceremonial blade or adze, mimicking the act of opening the senses. The purpose was chilling but profound. The dead could not eat, speak, or see in the afterlife unless their senses were magically restored. Without this ritual, the soul risked wandering blind and mute in eternity. What's even stranger is that this wasn't always performed on a body. In cases where a corpse was missing, perhaps lost in battle or destroyed by accident, priests carried out the ritual on a statue or symbolic substitute. Sometimes, a wooden effigy would serve as the stand-in for the deceased, receiving the ritual touches and incantations. To the Egyptians, the material didn't matter, it was the ritual that brought life back, bridging the gap between worlds. Imagine the eerie sight of priests treating a carved figure as if it were breathing flesh. To them, it wasn't pretend. It was deadly serious. These ceremonies also reveal something darker about Egyptian society, the immense power priests held over people's fears of the afterlife. The common Egyptian farmer or craftsman might toil his whole life for a modest tomb, but without the sanctioned rituals performed by temple priests, his chances in the afterlife looked grim. This dependence gave priests enormous influence. They weren't just religious leaders, they were gatekeepers to eternity. Refuse their authority, and your soul could be doomed. In a way, death became a tool of social control, wielded through ritual. But the opening of the mouth was only the beginning. Once restored, the soul had to navigate the terrifying journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. And here again, ritual played a vital role. Priests and family members recited spells from the Book of the Dead, texts often buried alongside the deceased. These weren't mere prayers, they were literal instructions, a cosmic survival guide for the soul. The papyrus scrolls described passwords for gates, names of demons, and magical formulas to ward off monsters lurking in the shadows. Without these spells, the soul risked annihilation. Imagine walking into a labyrinth full of deadly traps, with only a guidebook to get you through. That's what death looked like to the ancient Egyptian. One of the strangest and most terrifying parts of this journey came at the weighing of the heart. Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of memory and morality, it recorded every action of a person's life. In the hall of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice, the dead stood before Osiris, ruler of the underworld. Their heart was placed on a great scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, untainted by lies and cruelty, the soul passed into paradise. But if it was heavy with sin, a monstrous creature named Ammit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, devoured it whole. No rebirth. No second chance. Eternal oblivion. This fear of judgment shaped countless rituals around death. Egyptians placed amulets over the heart to silence it during judgment, ensuring it would not confess misdeeds. Some spells were written specifically to trick the scales or persuade Osiris. In a sense, the Egyptians invented not just burial rituals, but spiritual life hacks to cheat death itself. And these practices weren't limited to kings and nobles. The poorest villagers tried, in their own small ways, to secure protection for their souls. Beyond the grand ceremonies, even simple families engaged in rituals for the dead. Food offerings, water libations, and incense were provided at tomb chapels. To the Egyptians, these weren't symbolic gestures. They believed the dead consumed the essence of these offerings. Without them, the soul could grow hungry, restless, even vengeful. Families who neglected rituals risked hauntings. The dead might return, demanding the respect and sustenance they were owed. In this way, rituals kept the bond between living and dead alive, turning Egyptian society into a culture where the grave was never truly silent. And then there were the darker whispers, rituals that blurred the line between devotion and fear. Some scholars believe that in the earliest dynasties, servants were sacrificed and buried alongside their rulers, forced into the afterlife as attendants. Though later replaced with symbolic figures like Shabti dolls, the idea lingers as a reminder of how far the Egyptians were willing to go to prepare for eternity. To them, the afterlife was so real, so urgent, that even death itself demanded more death. So when we think of pyramids, golden tombs, and mummies, we must remember, these were not monuments to the past. They were launchpads to the future, an eternal future powered by ritual. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not a conclusion. It was a challenge. A dangerous, uncertain, yet navigable road that only the strangest and most sacred ceremonies could unlock. And this was just the first layer of their ritual world. Beyond death lay stranger practices still, rituals of blood, sacrifice, magic, and even chaos. But at the heart of it all was one unshakable belief: if you followed the rituals, no matter how bizarre or unsettling, you could live forever. For the ancient Egyptians, life and death were inseparably entwined with the sacred waters of the Nile. Every year, the river's flood nourished the land, but it also reminded people that life was fragile, temporary, and governed by forces far beyond human control. It is in this context that ritual sacrifice emerged, not merely as superstition, but as a vital act believed to maintain cosmic balance. Blood, whether human or animal, was seen as a powerful conduit between the living and the divine, a way to feed gods, appease spirits, and secure favor in both this world and the next. The evidence for ritual sacrifice in ancient Egypt is both fascinating and unsettling. Tomb inscriptions, temple carvings, and papyrus texts describe offerings ranging from food and incense to more extreme acts, sometimes even taking human life. Scholars argue that in Egypt's earliest dynasties, particularly during the first and second, kings may have demanded the lives of servants or prisoners to accompany them into death. These individuals were not merely sacrificial, in a symbolic sense, they were expected to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife, fulfilling duties that the living king could not perform alone. Archaeological digs near early royal tombs have uncovered graves containing multiple individuals, laid out in ways that suggest ritualized burial rather than random violence. The implication is chilling: death was not only a spiritual necessity but a social one, enforced by power and fear. Yet human sacrifice was only one layer of the Egyptian sacrificial world. Animals played an equally central role, often in far more visible and shocking ceremonies. Cats, bulls, ibises, and even crocodiles were considered sacred, each embodying a different god or cosmic force. The Apis bull, for instance, was revered as a living manifestation of Ptah, the god of creation. When the bull died, elaborate rituals ensured its transition to the divine realm. Priests would chant, anoint, and parade the animal in grand ceremonies before performing the ultimate act, ritual slaughter. Its meat and blood were often used in subsequent temple rites or buried alongside offerings, reinforcing the belief that the god's favor could be nourished through sacrifice. Some of the most astonishing finds come from the millions of mummified animals discovered across Egypt. Thousands of ibises were ritually killed, wrapped, and interred in catacombs, far outnumbering human burials in some periods. These weren't casual acts of devotion, they were large-scale operations, indicating an entire economy devoted to sacrificial animals. Farmers bred sacred animals specifically for temples, and priests became powerful figures not only in religion but in controlling this ritual economy. The scale alone gives a sense of how integral sacrifice was to Egyptian society. It was everywhere, and everyone, from pharaohs to peasants, participated in some way. But why did the Egyptians place such a high price on blood? The answer lies in their worldview. Blood was considered the life force itself, a substance that could bridge the gap between mortality and divinity. Pouring it on an altar, whether from a human or a bull, was thought to nourish the gods, renew the cosmos, and protect communities from famine, disease, or divine wrath. Rituals were precise and repetitive, often following strict calendrical schedules. Festivals marking the death and rebirth of gods like Osiris involved symbolic sacrifices of animals and plants, reenacting cosmic battles in miniature. Participation was not optional, it was a civic and spiritual duty. Interestingly, some of these ceremonies blurred the line between reverence and terror. For example, certain texts describe ritual killings performed with highly specific methods to ensure the purity of the offering. Priests had to avoid spilling blood improperly, lest the act offend the deity and bring disaster. Some victims, particularly in early dynastic tombs, may have been killed with ceremonial daggers or strangled, ritualized, highly controlled acts that combined reverence with ritualized violence. The very precision of these acts underscores the Egyptians' obsession with order and cosmic harmony, even in something as extreme as death. Not all sacrifices involved actual killing. In later periods, symbolic substitutes became more common. Figurines, pots filled with blood-like substances, or effigies of humans and animals could stand in for real victims. This shift reflects both practical concerns and evolving religious sensibilities. Real human sacrifice became less common as the civilization matured. Yet the symbolic power remained just as potent. A small clay figure could, through ritual, act as a conduit to the divine, demonstrating the Egyptians' belief that intention and ceremony mattered more than the material itself. Ritual sacrifice also extended to the very landscape itself. Temples often contained hidden chambers or altars where offerings were buried, sometimes under thick layers of mud or sand. These sites became spiritual anchors, connecting local communities to gods in ways that ensured divine protection. Offerings of blood, grain, and other materials were carefully documented in temple records, emphasizing the dual nature of sacrifice, both a religious act and a highly organized administrative system. Even in everyday life, people performed mini-sacrifices at home, pouring milk, beer, or blood from small animals onto household altars, to ensure family health and fortune. Yet the line between devotion and fear was never far away. Many texts warn of divine retribution if sacrifices were insufficient or improperly executed. Gods could be vengeful, unpredictable, and violent. A neglected ritual could bring plague, famine, or the wrath of spirits. In this way, sacrifice functioned not only as a spiritual offering but also as a mechanism of social cohesion and control. People obeyed, feared, and participated, ensuring that the fabric of Egyptian society remained tightly woven around ritualistic practice. By examining these rites, a stark truth emerges: sacrifice, in all its forms, was the beating heart of ancient Egypt. It was a practice that connected the living to the dead, humans to animals, and mortals to gods. It was terrifying, intricate, and often horrifying, yet it gave meaning and structure to life along the Nile. Without these ceremonies, the Egyptians believed, the world would unravel, the river might stop flooding, the sun might fail to rise, and death itself could become final. Sacrifice, in the end, was the ultimate insurance policy against chaos. And so, as we turn the page to explore the rituals of the pharaohs themselves, it becomes clear that what occurred in temples and tombs wasn't mere superstition. It was a form of power, a sacred and bloody economy, and a societal glue that bound ordinary people and kings alike in the shared pursuit of survival, cosmic order, and divine favor. In the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was not merely a king, he was a living god, a divine bridge between mortals and the eternal forces that governed the universe. His body, his breath, his very presence were imbued with sacred power. And with that power came responsibility. The pharaoh was the central figure in a complex web of rituals designed to maintain cosmic balance, ensure the fertility of the Nile, and secure the prosperity of the nation. But these rituals were far from ordinary, they were secretive, elaborate, and often disturbing by modern standards. To witness them was to step into a world where divine authority, human obedience, and ceremonial spectacle fused into something almost otherworldly. The coronation of a pharaoh was the first and most significant ritual, a moment that symbolized the divine rebirth of Egypt's ruler. In preparation, the new king underwent purifications meant to cleanse both body and soul. He was bathed in sacred waters, anointed with oils infused with resins and spices, and adorned with ceremonial regalia that marked his status as Horus incarnate on earth. Priests chanted incantations to summon protective deities, ensuring that the king's physical and spiritual essence were fortified for the challenges ahead. But the ceremony also had a darker undertone. The pharaoh's authority was validated not merely by lineage or popular support, but by divine recognition. Any misstep in ritual could be interpreted as weakness, a sign that the gods might withdraw their favor. One of the most enigmatic and visually striking rituals associated with kingship was the Sed festival, a jubilee held to rejuvenate the pharaoh's power, often after 30 years on the throne. During this festival, the king performed symbolic acts that demonstrated his mastery over the forces of chaos. He ran in a ritualistic circuit around the sacred court, wielding scepters and wearing ceremonial crowns. This running was no casual gesture, it was believed to restore his vigor and reaffirm his divine mandate. Priests accompanied him, chanting spells and invoking gods to witness the renewal. Some scholars suggest that these festivals also involved symbolic tests of the king's fitness to rule. If he failed the ritual, showed hesitation or weakness, rumors and myths hint that replacement, or symbolic death, could follow. The stakes were unimaginably high, for the pharaoh's vitality was directly linked to the well-being of all Egypt. Yet the rituals of the pharaoh were not limited to public ceremonies. Many were deeply secretive, performed behind temple walls or in hidden chambers accessible only to the highest-ranking priests. These included rites of communication with the gods, where the pharaoh would enter trance-like states to receive guidance or predictions. Sacred objects, such as statues of deities, ritual knives, and inscribed tablets, were used to channel divine energy. Some rituals even involved symbolic acts of destruction, breaking objects or spilling liquids in precise ways to maintain cosmic equilibrium. Every motion, every chant, and every tool was prescribed, for any deviation could disrupt the delicate balance between the mortal and divine realms. The pharaoh's role in rituals extended beyond his lifetime. Death did not diminish his sacred duties, rather, it transformed them. Mummification, elaborate tomb construction, and funerary rites were designed to preserve the pharaoh's body and soul for eternity. These rituals were far more extensive than those performed for ordinary citizens, reflecting the king's unique status. The body was embalmed with intricate precision, organs removed and stored in canopic jars, and protective amulets placed within the wrappings. Priests recited spells to awaken the senses in the afterlife, ensuring that the king could continue to perform his divine duties beyond death. In essence, the pharaoh became a perpetual agent of ritual, alive in the physical world, active in the spiritual one. Some rituals reveal a level of extravagance and symbolic complexity that is difficult for modern minds to grasp. During funerary ceremonies, the pharaoh might be ritually reborn as Osiris, the god of the dead. This reenactment often involved elaborate stagecraft, statues of Osiris were brought into the tomb, symbolic offerings were made, and priests conducted performances that mirrored the cosmic drama of death and resurrection. The king's mummy was treated not simply as a body, but as a vessel for divine energy, capable of interacting with gods, spirits, and the living in ways that transcended ordinary human experience. This blending of theater, religion, and political authority created a spectacle both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Moreover, these rituals were not only about power and protection, they were also about control. The pharaoh's mystique was reinforced by the opacity of his ceremonies. Ordinary Egyptians rarely witnessed these sacred rites, which added to the aura of divinity. Fear, reverence, and devotion intertwined, ensuring loyalty and obedience. The king was not just a ruler, he was the axis around which the world turned. And when rituals went awry, myths suggest the consequences could be catastrophic. The Nile might fail to flood, plagues could strike, or cosmic disorder could spread. The rituals of the pharaoh were thus both spiritual and practical, linking divine favor directly to the nation's survival. Even in death, the pharaoh's rituals had political implications. Tombs and pyramids were more than burial sites, they were statements of eternal power. The alignment of pyramids with celestial bodies, the inclusion of temple complexes, and the careful placement of ritual objects all reflected a belief that the king's sacred duties persisted beyond mortality. In essence, the pharaoh became a permanent mediator between heaven and earth, a living god in life and an active force in death. The mysterious rituals of the pharaohs, therefore, reveal a civilization obsessed with the maintenance of cosmic order through human and divine action. They were elaborate, secretive, and often shocking to modern sensibilities, yet they formed the backbone of Egyptian society. Through these rituals, the pharaoh ensured that the Nile would flood, the sun would rise, and the balance of life and death would remain intact. It was a delicate, terrifying, and profoundly sacred responsibility, one that defined the very nature of kingship in ancient Egypt. By understanding these rites, we glimpse a world where power, fear, and devotion fused in ways unimaginable today. The pharaoh's rituals were not mere performance, they were the living thread of Egypt's survival, a testament to the extraordinary lengths a civilization would go to harmonize human life with the divine. To the ancient Egyptians, words were far more than a means of communication, they were instruments of power, capable of shaping reality itself. The spoken and written word carried immense spiritual force, and when used correctly, it could heal, protect, curse, or even kill. Magic was not separate from religion or daily life, it was woven into the very fabric of society, guiding behavior, securing survival, and asserting control over the unknown. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the use of curses. Curses in ancient Egypt were as varied as they were terrifying. One of the most notorious examples involved tombs. Inscriptions carved into the walls or etched onto coffins often threatened severe divine punishment to anyone who dared disturb the resting place of the dead. These were not empty threats. The Egyptians believed that disturbing a tomb violated Ma'at, the principle of truth and cosmic order, and that the gods would act decisively against the offender. The infamous mummy's curse that haunts modern imagination has its roots in these rituals, where priests invoked powerful spells to protect the tomb from thieves, desecrators, or disrespectful visitors. But curses weren't reserved for tombs alone, they were also weaponized against rivals, enemies, and perceived threats. Clay pots or figurines inscribed with a person's name could be smashed or buried in secret, a ritual designed to harm the target through supernatural means. In some cases, dolls representing enemies were pierced with pins or burned while the caster recited specific incantations. The act was believed to transmit pain or misfortune directly to the individual, demonstrating that in Egypt, psychological and spiritual warfare were inseparable. To be cursed was to live under the tangible threat of divine intervention, a reality that could shape the actions and fears of both ordinary people and elites alike. Magic also extended to daily life, from protection against disease to success in farming or trade. Amulets, often inscribed with sacred words or symbols, were worn on the body to ward off evil spirits or misfortune. The Eye of Horus, for instance, symbolized protection and healing, while small charms could invoke specific gods to ensure fertility, health, or prosperity. Some spells were written on papyri or carved into household objects, effectively creating a network of protective magic that surrounded Egyptians in every aspect of life. Words, when combined with ritual gestures and sacred objects, became a force that could shape the very world. The power of language was not purely protective, it could also be manipulative. Priests often recited complex spells during rituals to compel gods to act on their behalf. Chants, songs, and incantations were performed with strict pronunciation and rhythm, for even a slight error could nullify the magic. In this sense, mastery over words was mastery over reality itself, a terrifying and humbling concept that reinforced the authority of the literate and the powerful. Illiterate villagers, while unable to perform the spells themselves, depended on priests to mediate the magical world, further consolidating the influence of the temple elite. One of the strangest intersections of magic and ritual involved writing names. Egyptians believed that knowing someone's true name gave you power over them. As a result, inscriptions intended to curse enemies would carefully include their names, sometimes written on pottery or figurines. Conversely, protective spells could invoke the name of the owner to shield them from harm. This dual use of language, as both weapon and shield, demonstrates how deeply the Egyptians intertwined communication with cosmic influence. Words were alive, they could act, punish, and protect. Even death itself was bound to language and spells. The Book of the Dead, a compilation of magical texts, served as a manual for navigating the afterlife. It contained incantations designed to guide the soul, counter demons, and pass judgment with favor. These texts were meticulously written, often accompanied by illustrations of gods, monsters, and symbolic objects. A single incorrectly written word could imperil the soul's journey, showing the life-or-death stakes of linguistic precision. The written word, in this sense, was more powerful than sword or spear, it could determine one's eternal fate. Magic and curses also had a social dimension. By performing rituals or invoking spells, individuals and families could assert influence over events or people beyond their immediate control. A farmer might curse a neighbor who encroached on his land, a merchant could perform protective spells to safeguard his profits. The Egyptians lived in a world where the unseen, spirits, divine forces, cosmic law, was as potent as the visible. Magic and language were the tools to navigate this uncertain reality, offering both hope and terror in equal measure. In some cases, rituals combined multiple layers of magic, curses, and performance. Priests might conduct elaborate ceremonies where the spoken word, the written text, and physical gestures merged, creating a multi-layered ritual aimed at controlling forces both human and divine. These acts were not casual or superstitious, they were deliberate, precise, and believed to have real consequences. The Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of ritual power underscores a culture in which the mystical and the mundane were inseparable, and where words were weaponized in service of survival and control. Ultimately, the hidden power of words in ancient Egypt reveals a society that viewed reality as malleable, shaped by ritual and intention. Words were not passive, they were active agents, capable of invoking gods, protecting the living, punishing the wicked, and guiding the dead. In this context, magic and curses were not fringe beliefs, they were central to life, society, and the Egyptian worldview. To underestimate the power of language in this civilization is to miss the essence of what made Egypt both extraordinary and profoundly unsettling. Ancient Egypt was a land where the lines between the human and the divine often blurred, and nowhere is this more striking than in the worship of animals. To modern eyes, the reverence for creatures such as cats, bulls, crocodiles, and ibises might seem bizarre, almost surreal, but to the Egyptians, these animals were living manifestations of gods and cosmic forces. They were vessels of sacred energy, intermediaries between mortals and the divine, and sometimes even the focus of entire cults. Understanding this obsession reveals not only the religious fervor of ancient Egypt but also the extraordinary lengths people went to in order to honor, and sometimes manipulate, the sacred. Cats, perhaps the most iconic of all Egyptian sacred animals, were more than beloved pets, they were divine protectors. Linked to the goddess Batet, cats symbolized fertility, motherhood, and protection against evil spirits. Households often kept cats as living talismans, and harming a cat, even accidentally, was considered a grave offense punishable by law. But the reverence for cats went far beyond domestic life. Whole cat cemeteries have been uncovered, containing thousands of mummified felines, carefully embalmed and buried as ritual offerings. Some scholars suggest that these mummifications were part of a growing industry devoted to supplying temples with sacred animals, highlighting the intersection of devotion, economics, and ritual practice. Bulls were another cornerstone of animal worship, with the Apis bull being the most famous example. Considered a living incarnation of Ptah, the god of creation, the Apis bull was treated with the utmost reverence while alive and honored with elaborate rituals upon death. The bull's movements, markings, and behavior were interpreted as signs of divine will. When the bull died, priests conducted intricate ceremonies to ensure its passage to the afterlife, including embalming, parading, and interring it in a sacred tomb. The ritual was both a religious spectacle and a political tool, reinforcing the authority of priests and the pharaoh, who relied on the favor of the gods to maintain cosmic balance. Some animals were worshipped in ways that are difficult for modern sensibilities to comprehend. Crocodiles, for example, were associated with the god Sobek, a deity of the Nile, fertility, and military power. Temples housed live crocodiles, sometimes adorned with jewels, and special priests were tasked with their care. These crocodiles were not only objects of awe but also instruments of ritual. They were sometimes ritually fed or sacrificed to symbolize the power of Sobek to both protect and destroy. The image of a giant, armored predator venerated and nurtured by humans captures the Egyptians' willingness to embrace the dangerous, terrifying, and uncanny as sacred. The ibis, a bird associated with Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, was mummified in staggering numbers. Archaeologists have discovered catacombs containing hundreds of thousands of these birds, each carefully preserved. The scale of this practice is almost incomprehensible. Breeding, killing, and embalming countless animals for ritual purposes required an organized, labor-intensive system, showing that animal worship was deeply institutionalized. Unlike simple offerings of food or drink, these rituals demanded substantial investment and coordination, reinforcing both religious and social hierarchies. Interestingly, these sacred animals were not always treated as symbols alone, they were also believed to actively participate in the spiritual world. The behavior of a bull, cat, or crocodile could be interpreted as a direct message from the gods. Priests observed their actions with meticulous attention, reading signs, predicting outcomes, and advising rulers or ordinary citizens accordingly. In this sense, animals were not passive objects of devotion, they were agents of divine will, capable of guiding human decisions and shaping societal outcomes. The scale and intensity of animal worship also reveal the darker side of ritual devotion. Millions of animals were killed, mummified, or subjected to ceremonial acts of violence to maintain cosmic and social order. These acts were not merely symbolic, they were understood as vital contributions to the balance of the universe. The line between reverence and cruelty was thus blurred, a reflection of a worldview in which cosmic necessity justified extraordinary acts. In essence, the Egyptians' sacred animals were simultaneously protectors, symbols, and victims, a triad that underscores the complex moral and spiritual universe of ancient Egypt. This devotion also extended into the economy. Entire communities were engaged in raising sacred animals for temple use, creating an intricate system of breeding, care, and ritual preparation. Farmers and breeders became entwined with religious institutions, blurring the boundaries between economic activity and spiritual obligation. Temples thrived not only as religious centers but as hubs of commerce, where sacred animals were bred, mummified, and offered as gifts to appease the gods. The societal and financial implications of animal worship were as real as their spiritual significance, demonstrating the practical consequences of what might appear, at first glance, to be mere superstition. Moreover, festivals and ceremonies involving sacred animals could be both celebratory and terrifying. During certain processions, priests would parade mummified animals or live sacred creatures through the streets, chanting spells and invoking divine protection. Crowds gathered to witness these rituals, blending awe, fear, and devotion. In some cases, misfortune or divine wrath was believed to strike those who disrespected the animals, creating a pervasive cultural atmosphere in which the sacred and the dangerous coexisted. Ultimately, the worship of animals in ancient Egypt was not eccentricity, it was a profound expression of the civilization's values, fears, and worldview. By elevating creatures to divine status, Egyptians created a tangible bridge between the mortal and the immortal, the living and the spiritual. Sacred animals were simultaneously protectors, instruments of power, and conduits of divine energy, embodying the extraordinary lengths to which humans would go to interact with the forces beyond their understanding. In a society obsessed with order, life, death, and cosmic balance, animals were not merely pets or beasts, they were gods in fur, feather, and scale. Through this lens, the bizarre practices of animal worship reveal a civilization willing to embrace the strange, the dangerous, and the sacred in pursuit of divine favor. It is a reminder that in ancient Egypt, reverence could be both beautiful and horrifying, a testament to a culture where the boundaries of life, death, and the divine were continuously negotiated, one ritual at a time. When we think of ancient Egyptian medicine, images of skilled healers, herbal remedies, and early surgical tools often come to mind. But behind the veneer of wisdom lies a world where science, superstition, and ritual were inseparably entwined, a world where healing could be both miraculous and horrifying. In Egypt, medicine was not merely a practice of curing the sick, it was a sacred art, a ritualistic engagement with the forces of life, death, and the divine. Every treatment, every incantation, and every tool carried the weight of spiritual significance, revealing a society in which the line between medicine and magic was nearly non-existent. Central to Egyptian medicine was the belief that illness was rarely a natural phenomenon. Diseases were often seen as punishments from the gods, curses inflicted by spirits, or the result of malevolent magic. A toothache or fever might be interpreted as the intrusion of an evil force, and treating the condition required more than just herbs, it demanded ritual intervention. Priests and healers became intermediaries, wielding both medical knowledge and mystical power. Their methods combined practical remedies with incantations, spells, and amulets, creating a comprehensive system that addressed both the body and the spirit. Herbal medicine played a significant role. Remedies included garlic for infections, willow bark for pain, and honey for wounds, evidence of surprisingly effective natural knowledge. Yet even these treatments were imbued with ritual. Herbs were often consecrated before use, their efficacy believed to be enhanced by prayer or recitation of sacred texts. Some treatments required elaborate ceremonies, including chanting, burning incense, and invoking the protection of deities like Thoth or Sekhmet. The patient was not merely receiving medicine, they were participating in a sacred act that bridged the human and divine. Yet alongside these remedies were practices that appear horrifying to modern eyes. One particularly unsettling example was the use of mummy powder as a medicinal substance. Ground-up remains of mummies, sometimes including embalmed human tissue, were believed to possess potent healing properties. This grim treatment highlights the Egyptians' belief in the transformative power of death, where even the remains of the deceased could be harnessed to restore life. Similarly, bloodletting and other invasive procedures were sometimes performed not just for health but as ritual acts, intended to expel spiritual impurities from the body. The role of magic in medicine was equally pervasive. Protective amulets were prescribed to ward off disease, and spells were recited to expel evil forces from afflicted individuals. In some cases, healers would perform elaborate rituals over patients, invoking gods to oversee the treatment and punish any spiritual entities believed to be causing illness. Incantations might include precise gestures, specific words, and even drawings of deities, creating a multi-layered ritual designed to realign both the body and the soul. To fail in any component was to risk both physical and spiritual harm, underscoring the seriousness with which Egyptians approached the art of healing. Some of the most fascinating and macabre aspects of Egyptian medicine emerge from their understanding of the body and disease. While they had knowledge of anatomy, largely derived from mummification, their explanations for illness often attributed it to supernatural forces. Internal organs were linked to specific deities, and imbalance in the spiritual essence of these organs could manifest as physical symptoms. Treatment, therefore, required both physical remedies and ritual corrections. The healer was a conductor of unseen forces, using incantations, herbs, and tools as instruments to restore balance. Egyptian medicine also extended to preventive measures. Rituals were performed to protect against epidemics or misfortune, often involving offerings to gods, purification ceremonies, and protective charms. Pregnant women received amulets to safeguard both mother and child, while livestock was sometimes treated with spells to prevent disease from spreading to humans. The pervasive fear of divine retribution or spiritual attack meant that health was not merely a matter of biology, it was a constant negotiation with unseen powers. At the intersection of medicine and ritual, morality often played a role. Certain diseases were interpreted as punishment for wrongdoing, while healing could be seen as a reward for piety. This blurred the line between healthcare and social control. Priests and healers, acting as both medical practitioners and spiritual authorities, wielded enormous influence. The ability to cure or fail in curing a patient reinforced their status and power, intertwining physical health with religious and social hierarchy. Even surgical practices, though limited, were embedded in ritual. Procedures such as trepanation or wound treatment were often accompanied by spells and ceremonial gestures. The Egyptians' understanding of anatomy, informed by mummification, allowed for surprisingly sophisticated interventions. Yet these procedures were never purely scientific, they were guided by an understanding of the body as sacred, connected to cosmic and divine forces. Healing was as much about appeasing gods and spirits as it was about curing flesh and bone. The dark secrets of Egyptian medicine reveal a civilization where healing and ritual were inseparable, where the line between life-saving and terrifyingly strange was thin, and where the forces of the unseen world dictated the practices of daily life. Illness was not merely a physical challenge, it was a spiritual battlefield. The healer was a priest, magician, and surgeon rolled into one, wielding tools, herbs, and incantations to navigate this complex terrain. The fear of disease, combined with the hope of divine favor, shaped medical practices that were at once ingenious, ritualistic, and macabre. In the end, ancient Egyptian medicine was far more than a precursor to modern science. It was a window into a worldview in which life, death, magic, and religion were deeply intertwined. To understand their healing practices is to understand a civilization that confronted mortality with both ingenuity and terror, a society that wielded ritual, blood, and sacred knowledge to wrest control over the fragile boundary between life and death. In ancient Egypt, the forces of love, desire, and fertility were not private matters, they were deeply intertwined with religion, magic, and societal survival. Fertility, after all, was not just about human reproduction, it was a cornerstone of cosmic order, agricultural prosperity, and the continuation of dynasties. Egyptians believed that the forces that governed sexuality were sacred and that rituals could harness, enhance, or even manipulate these forces to influence the world. What may seem provocative, or even shocking, to modern audiences was, for them, essential for survival and divine favor. One of the most striking examples of fertility rituals was the use of amulets and charms. Both men and women wore symbolic jewelry intended to attract love, ensure conception, or safeguard pregnancies. Amulets shaped like genitalia, phalluses, or the sacred cow were common, embodying the generative powers of specific deities. Batet, the feline goddess of home, fertility, and love, was frequently invoked through charms or small figurines. Even everyday objects, such as necklaces, pendants, and carvings, could carry sexual symbolism, serving as constant reminders of divine protection over intimate life. Rituals surrounding fertility were not merely private affairs, they could be elaborate public ceremonies. Festivals such as the Feast of Drunkenness celebrated sexuality and life with performances, processions, and even ritualized indulgence. Participants would drink, dance, and enact myths of divine sexuality, symbolically ensuring the fertility of both humans and the land. These festivals blurred the boundaries between sacred duty and revelry, creating an environment in which pleasure, chaos, and spiritual intent merged. For ordinary Egyptians, participation was both a religious obligation and an opportunity to align with cosmic forces in the most primal way imaginable. Erotic imagery also played a critical role in ritual life. Temples and tombs contain carvings and paintings that depict sexual acts, divine unions, and fertility symbols. While these images might seem explicit, they were not intended for titillation, they were instructional, spiritual, and symbolic. They illustrated the cosmic principles of creation, showing that sexual energy was a divine force responsible for sustaining life. By meditating upon or ritualizing these acts, Egyptians believed they could tap into the same generative powers as the gods, influencing their own fertility, prosperity, and spiritual health. Magic spells were another integral component of love and fertility rituals. Incantations could be written on papyrus, carved into amulets, or recited during ceremonies to attract a lover, strengthen marital bonds, or enhance conception. Some spells were highly specific, invoking the names of both the practitioner and the desired partner, and detailing precise ritual actions. The effectiveness of these spells was believed to rely on strict adherence to words, gestures, and timing. To fail in any aspect was to risk frustration, misfortune, or even divine disfavor. The stakes were deeply personal but intertwined with cosmic order, reflecting the Egyptians' belief that love and sex were both intimate and profoundly sacred. Certain rituals also involved symbolic substitution or enactment. Dolls, figurines, or effigies could represent lovers or fertility intentions, manipulated in ceremonies to achieve desired outcomes. In some cases, sexual rituals were performed by priests or priestesses in temples as symbolic acts of divine union, believed to energize the land, crops, or royal lineages. This intertwining of sexuality, ritual, and cosmic purpose is difficult for modern minds to fully grasp, but to the Egyptians, the connection was as natural as the Nile's annual flood. Even daily life was suffused with fertility practices. Women carried charms in their hair or under clothing to protect pregnancies, men performed protective gestures or consumed ritual substances to enhance potency, and couples might consult priests for spells to overcome infertility. Every act was infused with both practical and spiritual significance, merging physical desire with sacred duty. Fertility was never simply biological, it was a negotiation with unseen forces, a dialogue between humans, gods, and the cosmos. Yet these rituals also reveal the darker undercurrents of Egyptian spirituality. Sexuality was a force of immense power and potential danger, capable of generating life or unleashing chaos. Improper rituals, disrespect for sacred symbols, or failure to honor the gods could result in misfortune, disease, or divine wrath. Pleasure and danger were inseparably linked, demonstrating a worldview in which even the most intimate acts carried cosmic consequences. Love and lust were not just personal, they were elemental forces that shaped society, agriculture, and the fate of nations. The pharaoh himself was often the ultimate participant in fertility rituals. His symbolic unions with goddesses, enacted through ceremonies and festivals, were believed to ensure the prosperity of Egypt itself. By embodying divine generative power, the ruler became a living channel for fertility, connecting the sexual and sacred, the personal and political. This illustrates the duality of Egyptian ritual: it was simultaneously private, communal, and political, integrating desire with the maintenance of cosmic and societal order. Through these rituals of love, lust, and fertility, the Egyptians confronted one of the most fundamental forces of existence. Sexuality was dangerous, sacred, and profoundly transformative. By codifying, ritualizing, and symbolizing it, they sought to harness its power, aligning human desire with the rhythms of nature, the cycles of the gods, and the ongoing survival of their civilization. What may appear shocking today was, for them, necessary, sacred, and essential, a testament to the extraordinary lengths a society would go to ensure life, continuity, and divine favor. In the end, Egyptian fertility rituals reveal a civilization that embraced the power of desire in ways both beautiful and unsettling. They show a culture where love, lust, and sexuality were not merely human experiences, they were divine instruments, cosmic forces, and instruments of survival. In ancient Egypt, passion was never private. It was sacred. It was terrifying. And it was essential. In ancient Egypt, burial was not merely a matter of disposing of the dead, it was the most sacred and elaborate ritual a society could perform. Death was considered a dangerous threshold, and the journey to the afterlife was fraught with peril, requiring preparation, protection, and an intricate web of ceremonies. Burial rituals were designed to ensure that the deceased could navigate this treacherous path, preserve the body, and secure a place among the eternal blessed. These rites, while breathtaking in their complexity, often reveal practices that are unsettling, macabre, and stranger than most modern imaginations can grasp. The preparation of the body was central to burial rituals, and it involved the art of mummification, which combined technical skill with sacred ritual. Embalmers meticulously removed organs, treated the body with resins and oils, and wrapped it in layers of linen, often placing protective amulets within the wrappings. Each step had a ritualistic significance. The heart might be left intact or carefully treated because it was believed to house the soul's moral essence, while the brain was sometimes discarded, thought to be unimportant in the afterlife. Priests recited spells throughout the process, invoking gods such as Anubis, the guide of the dead, to safeguard the deceased on their journey. The act of mummification was therefore not just preservation, it was a magical performance designed to make the dead eternal. Burial sites themselves were heavily ritualized. Tombs ranged from simple pit graves for commoners to the awe-inspiring pyramids of pharaohs, each designed to facilitate the soul's journey. The layout of a tomb was intentional. Corridors, chambers, and niches were arranged according to cosmic principles, aligning with stars or cardinal directions. Walls were often adorned with intricate paintings depicting scenes from the Book of the Dead, the afterlife, and symbolic journeys. These images served as both guides and protective wards, ensuring that the deceased could recognize landmarks, appease spirits, and overcome obstacles. In essence, a tomb was not merely a resting place, it was a carefully constructed spiritual map. The Book of the Dead itself played a crucial role. These texts contained spells, prayers, and instructions for navigating the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Priests often inscribed the spells on papyrus and placed them in the tomb, providing the deceased with a manual to confront demons, pass gates, and appease gods. Without these words, the soul risked wandering, lost and vulnerable. The texts also highlight the Egyptians' fascination with the supernatural, depicting terrifying creatures, fiery rivers, and monstrous beings that awaited the unprepared. Burial, therefore, was a matter of survival in a universe governed by both physical and spiritual law. Food, drink, and personal possessions were commonly included in tombs to sustain the soul. These offerings were not symbolic gestures, they were considered essential for existence in the afterlife. Granaries might be stocked with bread, jars filled with wine, and furniture or clothing carefully placed alongside the mummy. Some burials even included servants, or later, small figurines known as shabdas, designed to perform labor for the deceased in the next world. The inclusion of these items reflects a worldview in which earthly pleasures, practical needs, and societal hierarchy persisted beyond death. Rituals surrounding burial were highly formalized, combining mourning, magic, and performance. The opening of the mouth ceremony, for instance, was designed to restore the deceased's senses, allowing them to see, speak, and eat in the afterlife. Priests would touch the lips, eyes, and ears with ritual instruments while chanting spells, invoking the god's authority. The ceremony was often theatrical, with symbolic actions representing the restoration of life and power. Without it, the dead could be trapped in limbo, unable to interact with the divine or the living world. Some burial practices verge on the macabre. In Egypt's earliest dynasties, evidence suggests that human and animal sacrifices were sometimes incorporated into tombs. Servants, warriors, or sacrificial animals were interred to accompany kings in the afterlife, ensuring their comfort and protection. While later dynasties replaced these practices with symbolic substitutes, the underlying principle remained: the deceased required support, both spiritual and material, to navigate eternity. Even symbolic substitutes, carefully crafted and ritually blessed, could serve as effective proxies, demonstrating the Egyptians' belief in the magical efficacy of ritual over material reality. The secrecy surrounding certain burial rituals also highlights the Egyptians' obsession with cosmic balance. Priests who performed these ceremonies wielded enormous influence, controlling access to sacred knowledge and ensuring that rituals were executed correctly. Any error, mispronounced spell, misplaced amulet, or improper placement of offerings, was believed to imperil the soul. Tomb robbers, feared for centuries, were seen not only as thieves but as agents of spiritual chaos. Their interference could unleash curses, anger gods, or trap souls, revealing the terrifying seriousness with which burial and afterlife preparation were regarded. Finally, burial rituals reinforced societal hierarchies and divine authority. Pharaohs received elaborate tombs, treasures, and mummification processes far beyond what common citizens could afford, reflecting their semi-divine status. Yet even the simplest burial included symbolic rituals, ensuring that all Egyptians engaged in some form of cosmic negotiation. Death, in this sense, was not merely a personal transition, it was a societal and spiritual event, a reminder of the universe's order and humanity's fragile place within it. By examining these burial rituals, we see a civilization obsessed with the afterlife, blending artistry, ritual, and terrifying practicalities. Tombs were not just monuments, they were lifelines, magical laboratories, and theaters of cosmic power. The Egyptians' approach to death reveals a culture that confronted mortality with ritual, imagination, and extraordinary lengths of preparation, ensuring that even in the darkest shadows of death, the path to eternity remained navigable. In ancient Egypt, the dead were never truly gone. Their presence lingered in the world of the living, demanding respect, devotion, and ritual attention. Festivals and processions honoring the deceased were central to maintaining this connection, blending communal participation, spiritual observance, and sometimes unsettling displays of reverence. These rituals revealed a society that viewed life and death as continuous, intertwined, and profoundly interdependent, where the living played an active role in securing the safety, honor, and prosperity of the dead. One of the most notable events was the Festival of the Dead, celebrated in various forms throughout Egypt. During these occasions, families would gather at cemeteries or temple complexes to make offerings of food, drink, and incense to departed ancestors. The aim was both practical and spiritual. Offerings nourished the souls of the dead, ensuring that they could continue to watch over their living relatives, and reinforce the cosmic order by maintaining proper ritual observance. Mounds of bread, roasted meats, and jars of beer were laid upon tombs, while incense smoke curled into the air, symbolically carrying prayers and nourishment to the afterlife. Processions were equally elaborate. Priests and mourners would carry statues of gods, effigies of the deceased, and sacred artifacts through towns and along riverbanks. These movements were not ceremonial parades for spectacle alone, they were believed to animate spiritual power, making divine or ancestral energy tangible and accessible to participants. Chants, hymns, and ritualized dances accompanied the processions, each movement carefully timed to harmonize with celestial cycles, invoking protection, fertility, or divine favor. Observers were not passive, their participation amplified the ritual's potency, reinforcing the principle that the living were co-creators in sustaining spiritual balance. Death festivals often involve theatrical reenactments of mythic narratives. For example, stories of Osiris, the god of the dead, were performed to remind participants of the triumph of life over death, the necessity of justice, and the cyclical nature of existence. Actors, sometimes priests themselves, would impersonate gods or mythic figures, reenacting scenes of murder, resurrection, and divine judgment. These performances were deeply immersive, blending the sacred, the dramatic, and the terrifying. Witnessing or participating in them was believed to transfer cosmic understanding, allowing the living to comprehend their place within the grand tapestry of life and death. In some cases, the rituals could be unnerving. Participants might wear masks or costumes symbolizing spirits, demons, or divine judges, embodying the forces that the deceased would confront in the afterlife. Loud chanting, wailing, and ritualized gestures invoked both protection and fear, reinforcing the seriousness of the occasion. The Egyptians believed that the living could influence the fate of the dead. A neglected tomb or insufficient offering might result in misfortune, disease, or spiritual unrest for the family. In this way, the line between life and death was permeable, and the living bore responsibility for maintaining cosmic equilibrium. Priests acted as intermediaries, guiding the living in these rituals and ensuring that proper rites were observed. Their authority was immense. They directed processions, recited sacred texts, and performed precise gestures to transmit energy from the living to the deceased. Mistakes could have grave consequences, for any disruption in ritual order risked offending gods or leaving the deceased vulnerable. The living were not merely witnesses, they were participants, enmeshed in a moral and spiritual responsibility that extended beyond personal devotion. Some festivals, like the beautiful Festival of the Valley, combined reverence for the dead with communal celebration. Families and priests transported statues of gods from temples across the Nile to tomb complexes, symbolically linking the divine, the deceased, and the living community. Offerings were distributed, music filled the air, and large crowds participated, creating an atmosphere of both awe and subtle dread. These events reinforced social cohesion while underscoring the omnipresence of death and the necessity of ritual observance. The rituals of the dead also emphasized continuity. Children and descendants were expected to participate, ensuring that the family's spiritual obligations persisted across generations. Tombs were visited, prayers recited, and offerings made routinely, embedding respect for the dead into everyday life. Neglect was feared as much as death itself. Spirits could be restless. Ancestral protection could weaken, and misfortune could befall those who failed in their duties. In this sense, death festivals and processions were as much about ethical behavior and societal responsibility as they were about spiritual devotion. Even in private homes, miniature rituals mirrored public festivals. Small altars might contain food, figurines, or sacred inscriptions honoring family members who had passed. These acts reinforced the idea that the living and dead existed in a shared, overlapping reality, where attention, reverence, and ritual observance ensured harmony between worlds. Everyday life was thus inseparable from the spiritual realm, and the dead remained active participants in the social and cosmic order. Ultimately, these festivals and processions reveal a civilization profoundly aware of mortality and deeply committed to bridging the gap between life and death. The Egyptians understood death not as an end but as a transition requiring careful management, ritual, and communal cooperation. Through these practices, they ensured that the deceased were respected, nourished, and empowered to continue their role in the world of the living. The living, in turn, secured favor, protection, and continuity, creating a cyclical relationship in which both worlds relied on each other for balance, prosperity, and survival. Through the lens of these rituals, we see a society where fear, devotion, and celebration intertwined, demonstrating that in ancient Egypt, the dead were never truly gone. Festivals, processions, and communal participation ensured that death was both honored and managed, a continuous, living dialogue that shaped culture, morality, and cosmic order in ways both beautiful and terrifying. In ancient Egypt, the priests were far more than religious functionaries. They were the guardians of hidden knowledge, wielders of power that transcended the ordinary understanding of life and death. Within the temple walls, behind locked doors and sacred barriers, they controlled information that was considered so potent it could alter reality itself. Secrets of the cosmos, the afterlife, and divine rituals were carefully guarded, transmitted only to initiates through years of study, apprenticeship, and ritualistic initiation. These men, and occasionally women, possessed a knowledge that was at once awe-inspiring, terrifying, and, to outsiders, incomprehensible. Priests acted as intermediaries between the mortal and divine realms. They were the keepers of sacred texts, inscriptions, and spells, many of which were deliberately obscured through cryptic language, coded symbols, or oral instruction. The ability to read hieroglyphs alone was not enough. True comprehension required initiation into the mystical context, memorization of chants, and mastery of ritual gestures. These texts contained instructions for summoning divine forces, protecting the living from unseen threats, and guiding the dead through the afterlife. Misuse of such knowledge was considered catastrophic, capable of unleashing spiritual chaos or divine wrath. The power of the priests extended beyond the spiritual realm into political influence. By controlling access to sacred rituals, sacred animals, and knowledge of the afterlife, they wielded authority over both rulers and ordinary citizens. Pharaohs, despite their divine status, relied heavily on priests to conduct ceremonies, interpret omens, and ensure cosmic balance. In some cases, temples acted as political power centers, with priests effectively governing resources, labor, and economic activity under the guise of religious authority. The intertwining of occult knowledge and political influence reveals a civilization in which secrecy was synonymous with power. Certain rituals were considered so dangerous that only the highest-ranking priests could perform them. These rites involved communication with gods, invocation of powerful spirits, or manipulation of life and death energies. Texts hint at ceremonies in which priests could curse enemies, protect sacred relics, or influence the natural world, rituals that required precise words, tools, and gestures. Any error could be fatal, not just spiritually but physically, as these rites were believed to channel forces beyond mortal comprehension. This combination of secrecy, skill, and peril elevated priests to a status that bordered on the supernatural. Priests also played a pivotal role in education and initiation. Young acolytes would spend years learning not just hieroglyphic literacy but the philosophical, magical, and ethical underpinnings of their craft. They memorized complex incantations, practiced ritual movements, and learned the symbolism behind every sacred object. The training was rigorous, sometimes grueling, designed to prepare them for encounters with forces that could not be controlled without discipline. Initiation ceremonies themselves were highly secretive, often involving tests of loyalty, courage, and comprehension. Success meant access to powerful knowledge, failure could lead to expulsion, disgrace, or, according to legend, divine retribution. Much of the priest's forbidden knowledge revolved around the occult, the manipulation of hidden forces for protection, punishment, or cosmic alignment. Rituals might involve invoking spirits, conducting sacrificial offerings, or employing symbolic objects to channel energy. Priests were believed to mediate between the living, the dead, and gods, often performing acts that would seem miraculous or terrifying to lay people. In some cases, texts suggest they could foretell events, influence rulers' decisions, or enforce divine justice on those who violated sacred laws. Their mastery of occult practice ensured they remained indispensable, feared, and revered. Secrets were further protected through hierarchy and compartmentalization. Knowledge was rarely shared in full, each priest knew only the portion required for their role, preventing any single individual from wielding unchecked power. Temples were labyrinthine both physically and metaphorically, with hidden chambers, coded inscriptions, and restricted areas. Even high-ranking officials might be denied access to the deepest mysteries, emphasizing that the most potent knowledge belonged only to those deemed spiritually and morally prepared. This architecture of secrecy reinforced the mystique of the priesthood and maintained cosmic as well as social order. Despite the secrecy, some of this knowledge occasionally leaked to the wider world in the form of myths, rumors, or cryptic inscriptions. Tales of sorcery, miraculous cures, divine visions, and terrifying curses circulated among ordinary Egyptians, reinforcing the fear and reverence associated with priests. Outsiders, including foreigners, often imagined priests as magicians or sorcerers with powers that transcended natural law. These perceptions, whether accurate or exaggerated, enhanced the priest's authority, ensuring obedience and devotion from the populace. The relationship between priests and sacred animals also underscores their control over hidden knowledge. Animals such as cats, bulls, crocodiles, and ibises were not merely worshipped, they were instruments of ritual and channels for divine energy. Priests trained, cared for, and mediated these animals' spiritual roles, performing rites that could protect the living, bless the dead, or manipulate cosmic forces. The careful orchestration of these rituals highlights the intricate balance of secrecy, skill, and spiritual authority maintained by the priesthood. Ultimately, the forbidden knowledge of priests demonstrates a civilization obsessed with the unseen, the sacred, and the potentially dangerous. Their mastery over ritual, magic, and cosmic law allowed them to navigate realms beyond ordinary perception, shaping the spiritual, social, and political landscape of Egypt. Priests were not simply intermediaries, they were custodians of power, wielders of secrets, and arbiters of life, death, and the unknown. By guarding these mysteries, the priesthood maintained control over both the living and the dead, ensuring that ancient Egypt's complex interplay of religion, magic, and society remained intact. Their secrets were terrifying, awe-inspiring, and essential, a reminder that in a world dominated by the divine and the unknown, knowledge itself could be the most powerful force of all. The strange and often shocking rituals of ancient Egypt were not confined to the distant past, they left enduring traces that ripple through time, influencing cultures, religions, and even modern practices. From funeral customs to magical thinking, from symbolic art to spiritual beliefs, the echoes of Egyptian ritual continue to shape human behavior, demonstrating that the line between the ancient and the modern is far thinner than we often assume. By examining these legacies, we can uncover not just historical fascination, but a subtle, pervasive influence that persists in ways both obvious and hidden. One of the most enduring legacies lies in burial customs. Modern funerary practices, such as the use of tombstones, grave goods, and rituals to honor the dead, can trace symbolic roots to Egyptian innovation. The idea that the deceased must be provided for in death, whether through prayers, offerings, or physical objects, parallels the mummification practices and tomb preparations of Egypt. Even contemporary fascination with preserving bodies, embalming techniques, and the symbolism of afterlife-oriented rituals echoes the ancient belief that death is not an end but a transition requiring preparation, respect, and continuity. Egyptian influence also permeates religious and mystical traditions around the world. Elements of magic, spells, and incantations, central to Egyptian rituals, appear in later religious texts, ceremonial magic, and esoteric traditions. The use of amulets, protective charms, and symbolic objects to manipulate unseen forces is found in practices ranging from medieval grimoires to modern spiritualism. The concept that words, gestures, and symbolic objects can alter reality is a direct inheritance from the Egyptian worldview, where language and ritual were instruments of cosmic power. Even today, many cultural superstitions, such as avoiding misfortune through symbolic acts, reflect this ancient logic of cause, effect, and divine intervention. Art and iconography provide another channel of influence. Egyptian symbolism, particularly the representation of gods, sacred animals, and mystical hieroglyphs, has inspired countless cultures. The imagery of powerful animals, cosmic symbols, and ritualistic gestures persists in religious art, ceremonial practices, and even popular culture. Western fascination with the occult, the mysterious East, and the esoteric often draws directly from Egyptian sources, whether through the adoption of pyramidal motifs, sacred geometries, or the portrayal of priests and mages as keepers of hidden wisdom. The ancient Egyptian obsession with the interplay of life, death, and the divine continues to captivate modern imagination. Even psychological and cultural practices bear traces of these rituals. The Egyptian focus on moral conduct, cosmic order, and the consequences of one's actions mirrors modern ethical systems and concepts of karmic balance. Funerary texts like the Book of the Dead, with its emphasis on judgment and moral reckoning, have parallels in later religious texts that stress accountability and posthumous reward or punishment. The Egyptians' meticulous attention to ritual correctness, ceremonial detail, and symbolic action laid a foundation for the belief that structured practice could influence outcomes, a principle still visible in modern ceremonies, rites of passage, and spiritual observances. Moreover, the Egyptian preoccupation with fertility, love, and sexuality has left subtle cultural marks. Rituals designed to ensure reproduction, prosperity, and continuity find echoes in folk practices, fertility charms, and symbolic acts aimed at blessing families, crops, or communities. Many traditional and contemporary beliefs regarding the potency of sexual energy, symbolic objects, and ritualized intention can trace philosophical roots to the practices of ancient Egypt, where human desire was interwoven with divine will and cosmic balance. Even science and medicine, in a surprising way, carry fragments of Egyptian legacy. The combination of empirical observation with ritualistic practice in healing, the use of natural remedies, and the symbolic interpretation of disease reflect an early attempt to merge the practical with the spiritual. While modern medicine has largely abandoned magical elements, the notion that health, morality, and cosmic balance are interconnected persists in holistic approaches, alternative healing systems, and culturally rooted medical practices. The Egyptians' belief that the physical, spiritual, and cosmic were inseparable still resonates, reminding us that science and ritual once formed a unified worldview. The fascination with Egyptian rituals in contemporary media also attests to their enduring influence. Films, books, documentaries, and video games frequently draw upon Egyptian iconography, curses, and mystical practices, often highlighting their mysterious and shocking elements. This cultural fascination reinforces the idea that ancient Egypt remains a symbol of hidden knowledge, forbidden wisdom, and the dramatic interplay between life, death, and the supernatural. By engaging with these stories, modern audiences continue a dialogue with the rituals and beliefs of a civilization that existed thousands of years ago. Ultimately, the legacy of Egyptian rituals is a reminder that ancient practices were more than curiosities, they were frameworks for understanding the world, managing life and death, and negotiating the unseen forces that governed existence. Their influence on burial customs, magical thinking, art, psychology, medicine, and popular culture underscores a civilization whose innovations, fears, and beliefs have persisted far beyond the sands of the Nile. In this way, ancient Egyptian rituals continue to shape our modern world, offering insight, fascination, and sometimes subtle warnings about the enduring power of tradition, symbolism, and human imagination. Through the lens of these legacies, we recognize that ancient Egypt is not a distant, irrelevant past, it is an ever-present force, whispering through rituals, symbols, and cultural memory. The practices that once shocked, mystified, and awed have not vanished, they live on, reminding us that the sacred, the strange, and the powerful never truly disappear. As our journey through the strange and shocking world of ancient Egyptian rituals comes to an end, one truth becomes undeniable: these practices were far more than isolated curiosities or mere superstition. They were the heartbeat of a civilization, the invisible threads that bound life, death, and the divine into a single, continuous tapestry. From the sacred animals revered as living gods to the macabre intricacies of mummification, from the seductive power of fertility rituals to the secretive wisdom of the priesthood, the Egyptians created a universe where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were not only fluid but essential. To study these rituals is to glimpse a worldview in which every act, every gesture, and every word carried cosmic weight. Perhaps the most striking aspect of these rituals is the way they reflect the Egyptians' understanding of mortality. Death was never ignored, sanitized, or trivialized, it was embraced as a crucial transition, a perilous journey that demanded preparation, protection, and respect. Burial rites, the mummification of sacred animals, and the carefully orchestrated festivals of the dead all reveal a society intimately acquainted with the fragility of life. The living were not mere observers, they were participants, responsible for ensuring that the deceased could navigate the afterlife safely. Through ritual, the Egyptians sought to manage the terrifying unknown, transforming fear into order, chaos into structure, and mortality into a pathway to eternity. The role of magic, superstition, and the occult cannot be overstated. From healing spells and fertility charms to the secretive rituals performed by priests, Egyptian society was built on the premise that the unseen forces of the universe could be harnessed, negotiated with, or appeased. Knowledge was power, and power was guarded fiercely, often behind the walls of temples or the veils of ritual secrecy. Priests were not simply spiritual leaders, they were custodians of cosmic law, intermediaries between mortals and gods, and interpreters of a universe where even the smallest error could have catastrophic consequences. Their control over life, death, and hidden knowledge elevated them to a status that was simultaneously awe-inspiring and terrifying. Yet for all its rigor and ritual, Egyptian society was also unafraid to confront the strange, the shocking, and the provocative. Sacred sexuality, ritualized indulgence, and fertility rites demonstrate a culture willing to embrace human desire as a force intertwined with the divine. Sacred animals, mummified and revered, show an understanding of the world that is both mystical and highly practical, blending devotion with societal and economic structures. Even medicine, with its combination of herbal remedies, surgical skill, and magical intervention, illustrates the Egyptians' relentless quest to control the uncontrollable, to impose order on a universe governed by both visible and invisible forces. The visual and symbolic language of these rituals, hieroglyphs, tomb paintings, amulets, and statues, served as more than decoration. They were communication devices, instructions for navigating the afterlife, and expressions of humanity's enduring fascination with mortality, morality, and power. Every image, every gesture, and every carefully preserved body tells a story of a civilization obsessed with continuity, survival, and cosmic balance. These symbols, so carefully codified and preserved, continue to captivate the modern imagination, bridging a gap of thousands of years and offering a window into a world simultaneously alien and familiar. The enduring legacy of these rituals is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of all. Their influence extends far beyond the Nile Valley, echoing through religious thought, mystical practices, artistic expression, and even modern cultural fascination with the macabre and mysterious. The Egyptians' vision of life, death, and the sacred continues to inspire, terrify, and intrigue us, reminding us that rituals are more than mere acts, they are frameworks for understanding the world, for negotiating the unseen, and for confronting the ultimate realities of human existence. In the end, ancient Egyptian rituals were about connection to gods, to the cosmos, to the living and the dead, and ultimately to the enduring mystery of existence itself. They invite us to reflect on our own beliefs, our fears, and the ways we attempt to manage the unknown. Though thousands of years have passed, the fascination they inspire remains undiminished. Every tomb, every spell, every ritual act stands as a testament to human ingenuity, devotion, and the desire to transcend mortality. So as we leave behind the shadowed corridors of pyramids, the silent tombs of sacred animals, and the flickering incense of ancient temples, we carry with us a profound understanding, that in ancient Egypt, the boundary between life and death was a living, breathing space of ritual, magic, and awe. The shocking, the strange, and the sacred were never separate, they were entwined, shaping a civilization that continues to haunt, inspire, and mystify the world. In studying these rituals, we confront not only the past but the timeless human desire to understand, control, and honor the mysteries that surround us. Ancient Egypt remains a mirror, reflecting the depths of human curiosity, fear, and ambition. And in its rituals, bizarre, sacred, and sometimes terrifying, we find a civilization that dared to wrestle with the forces beyond comprehension, leaving behind a legacy that will never truly fade. If lawlessness defined the Wild West, then violence was its heartbeat. Every dusty street, every saloon, and every lonely stretch of prairie carried with it the possibility of sudden, brutal death. Forget the clean, choreographed duels of Hollywood films, the reality was bloodier, messier, and far more unpredictable. Contrary to what legends suggest, most gunfights weren't duels at high noon. Rarely did two men square off in the middle of town to settle a score with an audience watching in silence. Instead, violence often came without warning. A drunken insult in a saloon could spark a brawl that ended with pistols fired in the chaos. A poker game gone wrong could leave bodies slumped across a gambling table. And disputes over debts, women, or cattle often ended in sudden ambushes, one man reaching for his revolver while the other never had a chance to draw. This constant threat of violence shaped the very psychology of frontier life. Settlers walked through towns armed to the teeth, rifles slung over shoulders, pistols strapped to belts, knives hidden beneath coats. To live without a weapon was to invite death. It wasn't about being an outlaw, it was about staying alive in a place where arguments were settled with bullets, not words. The violence wasn't limited to personal disputes. Cattle rustling, for example, was rampant across the plains. A single stolen steer could spark deadly feuds between rival ranchers. Entire groups of armed men would gather to reclaim stolen herds, often leading to bloody clashes where casualties were inevitable. And unlike the romanticized cattle drives seen in films, these were dangerous, lawless affairs. Cowboys faced stampedes, bandits, and rival ranchers who were more than willing to kill over grazing rights. Then there were the infamous range wars, extended conflicts between cattle barons, sheep herders, and farmers competing for the same land. The Johnson County War in Wyoming is perhaps the most notorious example, where wealthy cattle companies hired mercenaries to wipe out small ranchers accused of rustling. Dozens were killed in these feuds, yet the perpetrators were rarely punished. In the end, might made right, and the land went to whoever could shed the most blood. Even towns that prided themselves on civility weren't immune. Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, names we remember today as iconic Western outposts, were once hotbeds of violence. Drunken shootouts erupted in saloons almost weekly. Gambling dens became slaughterhouses when tempers flared. And in some towns, the morgue filled faster than the church pews. Statistically, the frontier was staggeringly violent. In the 1870s and 1880s, the murder rate in many frontier towns was 10 to 15 times higher than the U.S. average today. To put that in perspective, a small settlement of just a few hundred people might see several murders in a single month. And these weren't isolated killings, they were woven into the fabric of daily life. But violence wasn't confined to towns and ranches. The expansion westward meant constant clashes with Native American tribes who were defending their homelands. Raids, ambushes, and massacres marked the landscape with blood. Settlers lived in fear of attacks on wagon trains or isolated homesteads, while native communities lived with the terror of sudden military retaliation. Each side viewed the other as invaders, and the result was a cycle of violence that scarred generations. For many settlers, violence was both a threat and a grim necessity. Families kept rifles at the ready not only for hunting but for fending off raiders, rustlers, or desperate drifters. Teaching children how to handle a firearm wasn't a choice, it was survival training. Life on the frontier demanded readiness to kill at a moment's notice, and those who hesitated often paid with their lives. It wasn't just men caught in this web of brutality. Women, too, lived under its shadow. Domestic violence was rampant, and the isolation of frontier life meant few avenues for protection or justice. Saloon girls and prostitutes endured not just exploitation but also frequent assaults, sometimes killed by drunken customers without consequence. The law rarely defended them, their lives were considered expendable in the larger scheme of frontier survival. Perhaps the most disturbing element of frontier violence was its casual acceptance. In modern times, a killing might dominate headlines for weeks. In the Wild West, it was Tuesday. Violence was so common that newspapers often reported shootings in just a few lines, buried beneath stories about crop yields or railroad expansions. Death became ordinary, and brutality became background noise. And yet, amid this constant bloodshed, a strange culture of reputation grew. Men who survived gunfights, whether fair or foul, gained notoriety. A reputation for violence could be as valuable as gold. It meant fewer people would dare cross you. The most feared gunmen often didn't need to draw their weapons at all, their names alone kept others in check. Violence wasn't just survival, it was currency. But reputations were fragile. One mistake, one unlucky moment, and even the most feared gunslinger could end up face down in the dirt. That was the paradox of frontier violence. No matter how many fights you won, death was always just one draw away. When we strip away the Hollywood illusions, what we see is a world where violence was not the exception, but the rule. It wasn't about dramatic duels under the desert sun, it was about messy brawls, drunken shootings, bloody feuds, and the ever-present specter of sudden death. The brutal truth is simple: in the Wild West, life was cheap. Disputes that today might end in lawsuits or arguments over social media were settled then with bullets. And for the men and women who lived it, violence wasn't a story. It was their daily reality, a reality that defined the frontier far more than the myths we remember today. The romanticized image of the Wild West often skips over one of the harshest realities of frontier life: disease was everywhere, and medicine was scarce, crude, and often deadly. While cowboys rode across endless plains and towns celebrated gunfights, most settlers lived in squalor, surrounded by filth, disease, and desperation. What Hollywood ignores is that, in many ways, the battle for survival wasn't against outlaws, it was against invisible enemies that could strike silently, swiftly, and fatally. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Towns sprang up overnight, without proper planning, drainage, or sewage systems. Waste often piled in the streets, mixing with dust, mud, and the runoff from livestock. Open wells and contaminated water sources spread cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Children played in the dirt, unaware that every step could bring infection. A single sip of water or bite of food could mean the difference between life and death. Doctors were rare, and their knowledge limited. Frontier physicians had little training, and many learned their craft through trial and error, or sheer luck. Surgical procedures were primitive, with no anesthesia or proper sterilization. Broken bones were set with crude splints, infected wounds were lanced and drained without antibiotics, because antibiotics didn't exist. Infections that today are treatable often proved fatal. Amputations were common, and mortality rates were staggering. Diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza spread with terrifying speed. Entire families could be wiped out in weeks. Unlike urban areas in the East, where hospitals or specialized care existed, frontier towns relied on home remedies, herbal concoctions, and faith. People prayed, applied poultices, and hoped. Many didn't survive. Graveyards in these settlements filled with children and adults alike, their graves unmarked, a silent testament to the deadly randomness of disease. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly dangerous. Women gave birth at home, often assisted by relatives or midwives with minimal experience. Complications were common, and without proper care, maternal and infant mortality rates were astronomical. A woman's life could be lost to a simple infection, and newborns often did not survive their first year. The frontier demanded courage, but courage could not protect against germs. Even minor injuries carried a lethal risk. A simple cut while working the fields, tending cattle, or chopping wood could become gangrenous or infected, leading to sepsis. Many settlers carried knives, but these were more often tools than protection. Accidents were inevitable, and medical help was rarely close by. What seems trivial today, a scraped knee or a puncture wound, could easily end a life in the Wild West. Mental health, too, was an overlooked struggle. The constant threat of violence, isolation, and disease took a toll on settlers' minds. Depression, anxiety, and grief were commonplace, yet rarely recognized. There were no support systems, no therapists, no treatment. People coped as best they could, through alcohol, prayer, or sheer stoicism, often masking the toll that the harsh frontier exacted on their mental well-being. Frontier towns were also vulnerable to epidemics. Smallpox could sweep through a settlement in days. Entire towns quarantined themselves when possible, but containment was often impossible. Railroads and stagecoaches, which promised connection to the outside world, also became vectors for disease. Migrants and travelers unknowingly carried infections across the plains, spreading illness faster than communities could react. Medicine itself was often more harmful than helpful. Patent medicines, advertised as cure-alls, were loaded with alcohol, opium, or toxic chemicals. People willingly consumed these mixtures, believing they were treating fevers, coughs, or digestive problems, often making conditions worse. Quack doctors roamed from town to town, promising miraculous cures for everything from snakebites to cholera. Many families, desperate for hope, paid whatever they could for these false remedies, only to lose loved ones anyway. The combination of filth, lack of sanitation, and poor medical knowledge meant that life expectancy on the frontier was alarmingly low. While some hardy individuals survived into old age, most settlers faced a constant dance with death. Survival was measured not in years but in weeks, days, and sometimes hours. Every cough, every fever, every small wound was a reminder that life was fragile and fleeting. Children were especially vulnerable. Malnutrition, infectious diseases, and harsh living conditions led to high infant mortality rates. Funerals for young children were frequent and tragic events, and families carried on, often having more children to replace the ones they lost. The frontier was unforgiving, and innocence offered no protection. Yet, amid this grim reality, settlers adapted. They learned which rivers were safe to drink from, which herbs could soothe pain, and how to isolate the sick to prevent entire families from dying. Communities formed around mutual aid, sharing whatever limited knowledge and resources they had. But these measures were temporary defenses against relentless threats. In essence, the Wild West was a landscape dominated by death as much as by lawlessness. Violence and outlaws captured imaginations, but disease, filth, and lack of medicine were far more consistent killers. Hollywood romanticizes the thrill of a gunfight, but a cough, a cut, or a contaminated well was often more lethal than any pistol. Survival required more than courage, it demanded luck, resilience, and constant vigilance. When we examine the reality of frontier life, it becomes clear, the West was not just wild because of its guns and outlaws, it was wild because every day was a battle against invisible enemies that could strike without warning. The harsh truths of disease and filth remind us that the frontier was not a land of opportunity for everyone. For most, it was a place where the line between life and death was thin, and fate often cruelly decided who would survive. If disease and violence defined the Wild West, then the living conditions made survival an almost daily battle. Hollywood may show frontier towns as quaint wooden streets and cozy cabins, but the truth is far harsher. Settlers endured dust storms, freezing winters, suffocating summers, and homes barely fit for shelter. Life in the West was a test of endurance, where comfort was a luxury few could afford, and despair was a constant companion. Most settlers did not live in the charming log cabins often depicted in films. The majority resided in sod houses, crude wooden shacks, or tents, hastily built to withstand the harsh climate. Sod houses were little more than mud walls reinforced with grass and dirt. They leaked in the rain, offered minimal insulation against freezing winters, and were infested with insects and rodents. Wood, the material most settlers dreamed of, was often scarce, forcing families to improvise with what little they could find. Dust was a relentless enemy. Prairie winds swept across the plains, carrying fine particles that infiltrated every home, every bed, and every meal. Settlers' clothes, dishes, and furniture were coated in a layer of dust that never seemed to settle. Dust storms could last for days, reducing visibility to almost nothing, making travel hazardous and forcing families to stay indoors in suffocating, choking conditions. Imagine children coughing in dusty corners while mothers fought to sweep dirt and debris from their fragile shelters. Summers brought scorching heat, while winters brought snow, ice, and bone-chilling cold. Fires were essential, yet wood was limited and often damp, producing little warmth. Many families huddled in small rooms, wrapped in whatever cloth or animal hides they could find, desperately trying to survive the freezing nights. Hypothermia and frostbite were constant threats, and even a single night without adequate heat could prove fatal for children or the elderly. Food scarcity added another layer of desperation. Settlers relied on what they could grow, hunt, or preserve, but crop failures, droughts, or infestations could wipe out entire harvests. When food ran low, families resorted to spoiled meat, roots, or even insects. Malnutrition weakened the body, making settlers more susceptible to disease, infection, and exhaustion. For many, hunger was not a temporary inconvenience, it was a constant, gnawing companion that shadowed every day. Sanitation was another brutal reality. With no indoor plumbing, families used outhouses, dugouts, or nearby streams, often contaminating drinking water in the process. Waste and filth were a part of daily life, and hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. Settlers' bodies, clothing, and homes reeked of smoke, sweat, and the ever-present dust of the plains. Washing was a luxury, a rare occurrence reserved for major events or visitors, rather than a daily habit. Isolation compounded these hardships. Many families lived miles from the nearest neighbor or town. A trip to get supplies could take days on horseback, across rough terrain teeming with wild animals and dangerous weather. Children often roamed the plains unsupervised, learning survival skills early, or paying the ultimate price for mistakes. Illness, injury, or attacks could strike without warning, leaving families completely alone to cope. Animals, both domestic and wild, were constant intruders in daily life. Settlers' homes were often shared with chickens, pigs, or cows, which kept vermin away from their food but contributed to disease and filth. Wolves, bears, and coyotes threatened livestock and occasionally humans. Even horses, essential for transportation, required daily care and could not be taken for granted. A sick or lost horse could mean disaster for a family relying on it for survival. Despite these hardships, some settlers tried to create small comforts. Homemade furniture, quilts, and simple decorations gave homes a sense of normalcy. But these attempts were fragile against the relentless assault of weather, pests, and scarcity. Every comfort came with labor and sacrifice, and often, it was temporary. A single storm or drought could undo months of hard work in an instant. Children endured the brunt of these brutal conditions. They woke early to fetch water, tend animals, or help in the fields. Education was often sporadic, limited to one-room schoolhouses or a parent's instruction. Play was dangerous, survival was mandatory, and many children learned the harsh truths of life before reaching their teens. Mortality was high, and childhood was often cut short by accident, illness, or exposure. Yet, despite the misery, settlers adapted. They developed resourcefulness, inventiveness, and resilience that allowed them to endure what would break most people. They learned which crops could survive drought, which materials provided better insulation, and how to navigate the dangers of extreme weather. But even with these skills, life in the Wild West was rarely comfortable or safe. It was a constant struggle against the environment itself. The brutal living conditions also shaped the culture and mentality of the frontier. People became tough, suspicious, and fiercely independent. Trust was hard to come by, because survival demanded vigilance at every turn. And while stories of courage and resilience are celebrated, they often hide a darker truth. Life in the West was relentless, unforgiving, and deeply unforgiving to those who faltered. In the end, the dirt, dust, and desperation of frontier living were more than obstacles, they were defining characteristics of the Wild West. They forged a generation that could survive unimaginable hardship, but at tremendous cost. Childhoods were stolen, families broken, and comfort was a fleeting dream. For those who lived it, the West was not a land of adventure, it was a place where every day was a fight to simply endure. When most people think of the Wild West, the image that comes to mind is that of the cowboy, rugged, fearless, riding across endless plains, quick with a gun, and loyal to a strict code of honor. Movies and novels have painted cowboys as romantic figures, embodying freedom and adventure. But the truth about cowboys is far more gritty, dangerous, and unglamorous than the legends suggest. For starters, most cowboys were far from the wealthy, heroic figures Hollywood portrays. They were young men, often between the ages of 16 and 25, and the majority were poor or came from marginalized communities. A significant number were African American, Mexican, or Native American, yet their contributions have been largely erased from mainstream history. These men were often called vaqueros in the Southwest, and they brought vital skills in cattle handling that would shape cowboy culture, but their stories rarely made it into the dime novels and later films. Pay was miserable. Cowboys earned about $25–40 a month, barely enough to cover food, clothing, and equipment. Long cattle drives offered no extra compensation for the risk and grueling labor involved. A single misstep could mean being trampled by cattle, falling from a horse, or suffering injuries that left a man permanently disabled, with no safety net or compensation. The work was relentless, 16-hour days under scorching sun or freezing rain, with little rest and constant danger. Life on the trail was not glamorous. Cowboys slept on the ground, often with nothing more than a blanket or a bedroll. They ate simple, repetitive meals, beans, bacon, coffee, and whatever they could hunt along the way. Fresh vegetables were rare, and spoiled food was a constant threat, bringing illness to already exhausted men. Hygiene was minimal, bathing was a rare luxury, and lice, fleas, and other pests were constant companions. The danger wasn't limited to labor. Violence and lawlessness followed cowboys wherever they went. Stagecoach robberies, ambushes by outlaws, and disputes over land and cattle meant a cowboy's life was constantly on the line. Many met their end far from towns, either by accident, disease, or violent confrontation. Hollywood duels at high noon are few and far between. The real threat was random, sudden, and often deadly. Cowboys were also at the mercy of the land itself. The open plains and rugged terrain were unforgiving. Rivers could sweep away horses and men, stampedes could crush the unwary, and storms could leave a trail of death and destruction. Survival required constant vigilance, courage, and instinct, but even the most experienced cowboy could fall victim to the environment. Social life for cowboys was rough and solitary. Many were young men far from home, without families or stable communities. Loneliness was common, and companionship was often found in the saloon or around a campfire. Alcohol and gambling became both entertainment and escape, offering brief relief from the harsh realities of life on the trail. But indulgence carried risk, fights were frequent, and violence could erupt over the smallest slight. Yet, despite the hardship, cowboys developed a strong code of conduct, not a code of honor dictated by law, but a practical guide to surviving in a world full of danger. Loyalty to fellow cowhands, respect for skilled work, and careful handling of cattle were essential. A cowboy who broke this code often faced ostracism, ridicule, or worse, from his peers. Survival depended as much on cooperation as on individual toughness. Many cowboys died young. Accidents, disease, and violence claimed lives in their 20s or early 30s. Rarely did a cowboy enjoy the decades-long adventures depicted in novels and films. Those who survived often retired to modest farms or ranches, far from the romanticized adventures of their youth. The legends of the fearless, untouchable gunslinger often overshadow the reality of a short, grueling life filled with labor, hardship, and constant risk. Women and minorities played crucial but overlooked roles in cowboy culture. African American cowboys, for instance, made up roughly 1 in 4 cowhands after the Civil War. They brought essential skills, knowledge of livestock, and resilience under extreme conditions, yet their stories were largely erased from popular culture. Similarly, Mexican vaqueros influenced every aspect of cowboy life, from roping techniques to riding styles, yet they remain largely invisible in the romanticized narrative of the American West. Cattle drives themselves were brutal. Men rode for weeks or months, covering hundreds of miles with thousands of animals. They faced exhaustion, storms, disease among the herd, and occasional attacks from outlaws or rival ranchers. Night watches were constant, with cowboys taking turns guarding the herd from predators and thieves. A single lapse could mean the loss of hundreds of animals, and, with them, the cowboys' livelihood. It wasn't just physical endurance that defined cowboys, it was also mental toughness. Isolation, monotony, and uncertainty required a certain resilience. Long stretches of silence on the open plains tested patience and willpower, while the constant presence of danger kept adrenaline and anxiety high. Cowboys needed to think quickly, act decisively, and trust in both their skills and their instincts to survive. Despite the myths, there were few lone gunslinger heroes. Cowboys were part of communities, bound by necessity and survival. They depended on each other for protection, work, and companionship. They were far more craftsmen and laborers than the romanticized gunfighters that dominate films and books. The real cowboy was not a legend, they were men who worked, struggled, and survived in a world that offered them little beyond hardship. Ultimately, the truth about cowboys shatters the image of the Wild West hero. They were young, poor, often marginalized, and subjected to grueling labor, constant danger, and short lives. Their courage and skill were undeniable, but it was a courage born out of necessity, not glory. The cowboy's life was defined by endurance, resilience, and the relentless demands of a brutal, unforgiving frontier. When we strip away the myths and legends, the romantic image fades, leaving behind the real story. Cowboys were ordinary men living extraordinary, often deadly, circumstances. They did not ride endlessly into adventure, they survived, day by day, on a land that demanded everything and gave almost nothing in return. When we think of the Wild West, women rarely come to mind. Pop culture often reduces them to saloons, dresses, and damsels in distress, but the reality was far harsher, and far more complex. Frontier women were not passive observers of history, they were survivors, laborers, pioneers, and sometimes, the backbone of entire communities. Their lives were filled with toil, danger, and unrelenting hardship, often overshadowed by the violence, disease, and lawlessness that defined the era. For most women, life was an unending struggle. Domestic labor consumed every waking hour, and it was far more physically demanding than the images of genteel housewives in novels suggest. Chores included fetching water from distant wells, chopping firewood, tending gardens, preparing meals over open fires, and washing clothes by hand, often in freezing rivers or muddy streams. Each task was exhausting, repetitive, and crucial for survival. A mistake could lead to illness, starvation, or the death of a family member. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Without doctors or hospitals, women gave birth at home, often assisted by midwives with limited experience. Complications were common, and both maternal and infant mortality rates were devastatingly high. In some settlements, nearly 1 in 10 women died in childbirth, and many newborns never survived their first year. Pain, infection, and despair were constant companions, shaping the lives of women in ways rarely portrayed in romanticized accounts of the West. Some women found themselves working outside the home simply to survive. Many became prostitutes or saloon girls, often under coercive circumstances or economic necessity. The saloon culture of the West was dangerous. Long hours, sexual exploitation, violence, and substance abuse were routine. Women working in these environments walked a thin line between survival and victimhood, with few legal protections and little societal support. Yet, they were also shrewd, resourceful, and capable of wielding influence within their communities, whether through business, social networks, or sheer determination. Other women took on roles that defied traditional gender norms. Some ran homesteads alone after losing husbands to violence or disease. Others became ranchers, sharpshooters, or law enforcers, demonstrating courage and skill in environments that often considered them expendable. Figures like Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley were exceptional, but they highlight a broader truth: women were capable of resilience and bravery that rivaled any cowboy or outlaw. Violence did not spare women. Domestic abuse, sexual assault, and harassment were rampant. Isolated homesteads made women vulnerable to criminals, outlaws, and occasionally even neighbors. The law rarely intervened. Sheriffs and marshals were often more concerned with protecting property or men of influence than safeguarding women. For many, survival required constant vigilance, quick thinking, and the ability to defend themselves with whatever means were available. Food preparation, childcare, and daily labor were all physically grueling, yet women also faced the emotional burden of loss. Disease, accidents, and violence claimed family members with startling frequency. Children were born into a world where death was a constant presence, and women bore the dual responsibility of nurturing life while preparing for its fragility. They mourned silently and continued to work tirelessly, often without acknowledgement or support. Despite these hardships, frontier women created communities and support networks. They shared resources, knowledge, and labor, forming informal systems of mutual aid that helped families survive. They taught one another herbal remedies, farming techniques, and child-rearing strategies in a world where formal education and medical care were scarce. These networks were lifelines, especially for widows or single mothers, and they exemplified the resilience and ingenuity required to endure frontier life. Education was another battleground. Many women valued literacy and learning, establishing schools in settlements where formal education was otherwise unavailable. Teaching was often combined with domestic labor and farm work, meaning that women carried double burdens. The sacrifices they made to educate children, particularly daughters, were monumental, yet rarely celebrated in the historical record. In towns with saloons and gambling halls, women had to navigate complex social hierarchies. Respectability could be a matter of survival. Reputation mattered, yet it could also be a trap. A single rumor or accusation could lead to ostracization, violence, or economic ruin. Survival often depended on pragmatism, wit, and resilience, qualities that required constant vigilance and adaptability. Some women even wielded power in the shadows of male-dominated societies. Matriarchs of homesteads controlled household economies, negotiated with neighbors and traders, and ensured that families had what they needed to survive harsh winters and poor harvests. These women were unsung strategists, balancing the immediate demands of survival with long-term planning in an environment that offered no margin for error. The reality of women's lives in the Wild West shatters any romantic notions of carefree adventure. Their daily existence was a battle, waged against disease, exhaustion, social constraints, and constant danger. Yet, within this brutality, frontier women displayed ingenuity, strength, and courage that allowed families and communities to endure in one of the harshest environments in American history. In the end, the stories of women reveal a Wild West that is far more complicated than legends suggest. It wasn't just cowboys, guns, and outlaws. It was a landscape shaped by the labor, resilience, and courage of women, who fought daily for survival, dignity, and hope in a world determined to strip them of both. Their stories remind us that the true frontier wasn't merely a matter of geography, it was a test of endurance, adaptability, and unyielding spirit. The story of the Wild West is often told from the perspective of settlers, cowboys, and outlaws, but one of the most brutal and overlooked truths is the experience of Native Americans. For centuries, these indigenous peoples had thrived across the plains, deserts, and forests of North America, with rich cultures, traditions, and deep knowledge of the land. Yet the westward expansion of settlers brought displacement, violence, and devastation, transforming the West into a landscape of tragedy for Native communities. Settlers moving west often ignored treaties, stolen lands, and centuries of indigenous occupation. The arrival of railroads, miners, and homesteaders disrupted hunting grounds, destroyed sacred sites, and forced Native Americans into unfamiliar territories. The government's policy of forced relocation, including infamous programs like the Trail of Tears, uprooted entire tribes. Families were marched across hundreds of miles, often without adequate food, shelter, or protection, resulting in starvation, disease, and death. Conflict was inevitable. Native Americans resisted encroachment in whatever ways they could, from raids on isolated settlements to attacks on wagon trains. These actions were framed by settlers and later by history as savagery, but in truth, they were acts of survival and defense of homeland. Settlers often underestimated the organization, skill, and resilience of indigenous warriors, who knew the land intimately and could strike with precision and speed. Violence escalated quickly and brutally. Massacres, retaliatory attacks, and skirmishes became commonplace. Towns and forts were sometimes raided, leaving settlers dead or captured, while military campaigns against native populations often targeted women, children, and the elderly. The U.S. Army waged campaigns designed to crush entire communities, and battlefields often became scenes of horror, with bodies left unburied and survivors driven from their homes. The myth of the cowboys versus Indians battle simplifies a much more complex reality. Many native tribes sought peace, trade, or coexistence, yet the expansionist mindset of settlers and government officials left little room for compromise. When resistance occurred, it was met with overwhelming force, often disproportionate to the threat posed. Small villages could be destroyed in retaliation for minor raids or misunderstandings, creating a cycle of violence that seemed unending. Life on reservations was no reprieve. Native Americans were often forced onto arid, unproductive lands, far from the rivers, forests, or hunting grounds they depended on. Food shortages were severe, and starvation was common. Diseases brought by settlers, such as smallpox, influenza, and cholera, devastated communities already weakened by displacement. The social and cultural fabric of tribes was shredded, leaving scars that persist to this day. Children and women suffered immensely during this period. Families were torn apart by violence or forced marches. Young boys were sometimes recruited to fight or serve as scouts, while girls faced exploitation and the constant threat of abuse. The disruption of daily life destroyed traditional roles, ceremonies, and education. Survival demanded adaptation, yet every step forward was shadowed by loss, grief, and relentless oppression. The psychological impact of these conflicts cannot be overstated. Generations of Native Americans lived under constant fear of attack, coercion, or starvation. Elders struggled to pass down knowledge and tradition in an environment that punished cultural continuity. The trauma of witnessing violence, losing loved ones, and being forcibly removed from sacred lands shaped entire communities, leaving a legacy that echoed long after the frontier era ended. Settler narratives often painted Native Americans as obstacles to progress, erasing the violence and betrayal inflicted upon them. Historical accounts glossed over massacres, forced relocations, and broken treaties, instead romanticizing westward expansion as the triumph of civilization over wilderness. Yet the reality was stark: indigenous populations were decimated, their sovereignty ignored, and their survival repeatedly threatened. Even when treaties were signed, they were rarely honored. Land promised to native tribes was seized, sometimes under the guise of legal technicalities or manufactured claims. Settlers moved in, established farms, mines, and towns, and left native communities to adapt to an ever-shrinking world. Resistance was met with retaliation, legal manipulation, and military campaigns designed to eradicate opposition. The law was wielded selectively, favoring settlers while punishing those defending their homes. This brutal cycle of displacement and violence created long-term social and cultural disruption. Tribes were fragmented, languages and traditions threatened, and communities forced into dependency on government rations. The West, as settlers saw it, became open for exploitation, but for Native Americans, it was a landscape of suffering, resistance, and survival against impossible odds. Yet, even in the darkest moments, indigenous resilience endured. Tribes adapted, negotiated, and fought to preserve their culture, even under relentless pressure. Stories of courage, ingenuity, and survival abound, men and women defending their families, elders teaching traditions in secret and communities finding ways to endure despite starvation, disease, and military oppression. These stories are often overlooked in popular history but are essential to understanding the true complexity of the Wild West. The conflict between settlers and Native Americans reminds us that the Wild West was not simply a playground for cowboys and outlaws. It was a contested land, a battlefield, and a site of cultural devastation. The violence, betrayal, and displacement inflicted on native populations represent one of the most brutal truths of frontier history. While films and novels glorify gunfights and daring escapes, the reality for indigenous communities was far grimmer, a struggle to survive in a world increasingly hostile to their existence. In the end, examining Native Americans' experiences in the Wild West forces a reassessment of the era. The frontier was not simply about opportunity or adventure, it was a land of conquest, survival, and systemic injustice. Understanding this perspective challenges the myths we have inherited and highlights the courage, suffering, and resilience of indigenous peoples who endured a period that sought to erase them entirely from the landscape they had called home for centuries. Life in the Wild West was not just a battle against disease, violence, and harsh living conditions, it was also a battle against boredom, isolation, and despair. For many settlers, cowboys, and townsfolk, saloons offered an escape. They were a place of temporary relief, a social hub, and sometimes the only form of entertainment available for hundreds of miles. But behind the swinging doors and the cheerful clinking of glasses lay a far darker reality: addiction, ruin, and violence that often escalated to deadly consequences. Alcohol flowed freely in frontier towns, often cheap, potent, and poorly regulated. Whiskey, rum, and homemade spirits could be stronger than most modern liquors, and a single night of drinking could quickly turn deadly. Saloons were packed with men desperate to forget the harsh realities of life: long days of grueling labor, harsh weather, and the constant threat of violence. Drinking became a temporary reprieve, but for many, it was the start of a spiral into dependency and destruction. Gambling was another cornerstone of frontier culture. Poker, faro, and blackjack were played in every saloon, hotel, and makeshift gambling hall. A hand of cards could determine wealth, pride, or life itself. Men bet what little they had, risking wages, livestock, or even land. Cheating was common, tempers flared, and disputes often ended in gunfire or fistfights. The line between entertainment and survival blurred. Losing a bet could ruin a family financially, while winning could mark a man as a target for thieves or rivals. The combination of alcohol and gambling created a toxic social environment. Intoxicated men became reckless, violent, and impulsive. Saloon brawls erupted over minor insults, spilled drinks, or perceived slights. Knives flashed, revolvers were drawn, and sometimes, these disputes ended with death. Even lawmen were not immune. Sheriffs and deputies frequented the same saloons, and alcohol-fueled decisions sometimes led to corruption, brutality, or unjust killings. Addiction was common, yet misunderstood. Medical knowledge of substance abuse was virtually non-existent. Whiskey and opium were sometimes sold as remedies for pain, illness, or insomnia, creating a dangerous dependency. Men and women alike became trapped in cycles of self-medication, using alcohol or drugs to cope with physical pain, emotional trauma, or the crushing monotony of frontier life. Once addicted, options were limited, and recovery was almost impossible. Women, too, were affected by the culture of drinking and gambling. Many were forced to rely on men who spent their meager earnings on liquor and cards, leaving families struggling to survive. Others worked in saloons as bartenders, cooks, or entertainers, exposed to the constant temptation and chaos of alcohol-fueled violence. Some became dependent themselves, using alcohol or opium to escape exhaustion, grief, or abuse. The social consequences were staggering. Families were torn apart by addiction and debt. Marriages ended, children were neglected, and homes were abandoned. Entire communities could be destabilized by widespread drinking and gambling. Towns with booming saloon cultures often reported higher levels of crime, prostitution, and violence. Addiction was not a private matter, it was a public threat, affecting the fabric of frontier society. Saloons also served as breeding grounds for crime. Gamblers, con artists, and outlaws frequented these establishments, preying on the desperate and the unwary. Pickpocketing, cheating, and robbery were common. A man could walk into a saloon seeking camaraderie or fun and leave beaten, robbed, or dead. The line between recreation and danger was razor thin, and few ever walked away unscathed. Despite the risks, saloons were vital social hubs. They provided news, a chance to connect with others, and brief moments of camaraderie in an otherwise isolated world. But these fleeting joys came at a cost. Addiction, violence, and debt were constant threats, and even the strongest men could be undone in a single night. The frontier, after all, was not forgiving of weakness, whether in the face of nature, disease, or personal vice. Alcohol and gambling also had cultural consequences. They reinforced a rugged, reckless masculinity celebrated in frontier mythology. The image of the hard-drinking, gunslinging cowboy or outlaw was born from reality, yet it obscured the suffering and destruction behind the myth. Men often equated drinking and gambling with status or toughness, masking fear, loneliness, and vulnerability. It was a dangerous performance, one that often ended in tragedy. Opium and patent medicines added another layer of peril. Sold as remedies for everything from pain to insomnia, they often contained addictive substances, leaving settlers dependent and weakened. What was marketed as a cure frequently became another form of suffering, compounding the physical and emotional toll of frontier life. The harsh truth is that vice was a survival mechanism as much as it was a threat. Settlers, cowboys, and townsfolk turned to alcohol, gambling, and drugs to endure the relentless hardships of frontier existence. But these temporary escapes came with long-term consequences. Death, violence, and broken families were the price paid for moments of relief, highlighting a darker, often overlooked reality of life in the Wild West. In the end, alcohol, gambling, and addiction were more than social habits, they were tools of survival in a brutal, unforgiving world, and yet they were also destructive forces that undermined the very communities that relied on them. They reveal a Wild West defined not just by heroism and adventure, but by human frailty, desperation, and the cost of seeking escape in a world that offered few reprieves. The Wild West is synonymous with outlaws, gunfights, and the constant tension between law and chaos. From Jesse James to Billy the Kid, the stories of outlaws have captured imaginations for generations. But beneath the romanticized tales lies a far darker reality, a world where crime, betrayal, and sudden death were everyday dangers, and the line between hero and villain was almost always blurred. Outlaws were not cinematic antiheroes, they were often desperate men and women, shaped by poverty, opportunity, and circumstance. Economic hardship drove many to robbery, theft, and violence. Banks, trains, and stagecoaches were not just lucrative targets, they were symbols of authority and wealth that ordinary settlers could never access. Crime became both survival and rebellion, a means of asserting power in a world that offered few options for the marginalized. Gunfights, unlike the staged duels of films, were chaotic and deadly affairs. Rarely did two men face off at high noon with an expectant crowd. Most shootings were ambushes, confrontations in dark alleys, or explosions of violence following arguments, betrayal, or law enforcement pursuit. A single wrong move, a misheard word, or a panicked reflex could mean death. Outlaws lived under constant threat, not only from the law but from rivals, partners, and their own reckless choices. Infamous gunfights became the stuff of legend, yet the reality was far bloodier and more indiscriminate than history books often suggest. The gunfight at the O.K. Corral, for example, lasted less than a minute, but in that brief moment, 6 men were shot, 3 of whom died. Chaos, fear, and noise defined the encounter far more than any sense of honor or skill. Bystanders often scrambled for cover, and bullets rarely went where they were intended. Legends sanitize the horror, but eyewitness accounts describe panic, confusion, and screams, far from a choreographed showdown. Outlaws also operated in complex networks of loyalty and betrayal. Partnerships could dissolve with deadly consequences. Rival gangs competed for territory, resources, and influence, often settling disputes with bullets rather than negotiation. Even within gangs, mistrust was common, with betrayals leading to ambushes, murders, or arrests. Survival required cunning, vigilance, and an ability to anticipate threats from every angle. A single misstep could be fatal, and loyalty was often temporary. The law was inconsistent, corrupt, or absent in many areas, creating fertile ground for outlaw activity. Sheriffs and marshals often had limited manpower and faced immense risks in enforcing order. Sometimes, lawmen colluded with criminals, turning a blind eye for bribes or personal gain. Other times, they pursued justice relentlessly, leading to dramatic confrontations that ended with bodies on the street or in the dirt. The blurred line between criminal and enforcer added to the lawlessness, making trust a rare commodity. Travel was hazardous for ordinary settlers as well. Stagecoaches, trains, and wagon trains were frequent targets for robberies. Travelers carried cash, gold, or other valuables, and outlaws were often patient, calculating, and ruthless. A lone traveler or a poorly defended convoy could face armed ambushes with little chance of escape. Violence was sudden and indiscriminate, leaving survivors traumatized and often destitute. Some outlaws gained notoriety not just for their crimes, but for their sheer audacity. Jesse James robbed banks and trains with bold precision, but his legend obscures the deaths he left in his wake. Billy the Kid, romanticized as a young gunslinger, killed men in cold blood and evaded the law through cunning and speed. The mythology of outlaws often emphasizes charm or skill, but the historical reality highlights fear, cruelty, and relentless danger. Gunfights were also influenced by environment and circumstance. Narrow streets, saloons, and open plains all affected how confrontations unfolded. Cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws alike had to rely on keen observation, instinct, and lightning reflexes. Yet even the most skilled gunmen were vulnerable to accidents, misfires, and the unpredictable chaos of human panic. Legends often omit these mundane, terrifying realities, replacing them with tales of heroism and honor. Violence extended beyond the immediate gunfight. Retaliation was a constant reality, as family members, gang members, or lawmen sought revenge. Feuds could last years, with every encounter carrying the potential for bloodshed. Settlements lived under a shadow of fear, knowing that a single encounter with the wrong outlaw could have repercussions that lasted a lifetime. Ordinary citizens were often caught in the crossfire, their lives altered irrevocably by a world they could neither control nor escape. Death in the Wild West was sudden, often gruesome, and rarely noble. Outlaws met violent ends, shot by rivals, betrayed by allies, or executed by the law. Lawmen too faced sudden, brutal deaths in the line of duty. Life expectancy for those engaged in outlawry was short, and the notion of living to old age was a rare exception. The frontier exacted a heavy toll on all who embraced violence, whether for survival, profit, or notoriety. Yet, despite the danger, the mythology of the outlaw grew, fueled by newspapers, dime novels, and later films. Tales of daring robberies, narrow escapes, and dramatic showdowns captivated audiences far from the frontier, turning criminals into anti-heroes. In reality, these stories concealed the fear, bloodshed, and unpredictability that defined daily life in outlaw country. Romance and adventure masked a world governed by death, betrayal, and desperation. Ultimately, the truth about outlaws and gunfights is clear: the Wild West was a landscape of chaos, opportunity, and mortal risk. Gunfighters were not heroes, they were survivors, criminals, and occasionally, victims of circumstance. Their stories reveal a world where violence was omnipresent, trust was scarce, and every encounter carried the potential for fatal consequences. To understand the West, we must look past the legends and see the harsh, bloody reality beneath the myth. The Wild West is often romanticized as a place where lawmen upheld justice with courage and precision, standing between chaos and civilization. Yet the reality was far murkier. Sheriffs, marshals, and deputies were human, flawed, and often stretched beyond their means. The line between justice and corruption was thin, and the law itself was a fragile shield in a world dominated by violence, greed, and survival. Lawmen were often outnumbered and outgunned. Frontier towns were scattered across vast, unforgiving landscapes, and a single sheriff might be responsible for hundreds of square miles. Communication was slow, backup was rare, and criminals could disappear into the wilderness with ease. One wrong judgment or delayed action could mean a massacre, a robbery, or the escape of a notorious outlaw. The pressure on these men was immense, and mistakes were often fatal. Corruption was rampant. Some sheriffs and deputies collaborated with criminals for personal gain, taking bribes to ignore illegal activity or actively participating in robberies. Others tolerated vice, gambling, prostitution, and alcohol sales, because towns relied on them economically. Enforcement was selective, often favoring those with wealth, influence, or connections. The law could be an instrument of power rather than justice, and the people who depended on it were often left vulnerable. Even honest lawmen faced nearly impossible odds. Arresting dangerous criminals required courage and skill, yet miscalculations could be deadly. Gunfights erupted with little warning, and a single misstep could end in death or severe injury. Many lawmen carried the heavy burden of knowing that their presence alone might not prevent violence, and that the legal system offered little support or protection. Life on the frontier demanded constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and often, brutal pragmatism. Justice itself was inconsistent. Trials were rare, evidence was scarce, and jury pools were often biased or uninformed. Punishments ranged from fines to public hangings, but the law was frequently arbitrary. Outlaws could escape prosecution due to sympathetic witnesses, bribes, or simple lack of resources to pursue a case. Conversely, the innocent could be accused, tried, and punished with minimal evidence. The judicial system was fragile, often reflecting the chaos and moral ambiguity of frontier life. Town politics added another layer of complexity. Local officials had to balance enforcing the law with keeping economic and social peace. Saloons, mines, and railroads were vital to survival, yet they were often hotbeds of crime. A sheriff who disrupted business too aggressively could face backlash from citizens, merchants, or even fellow lawmen. Maintaining order required negotiation, compromise, and at times, turning a blind eye to maintain stability. The iconic duel at high noon is largely myth. Confrontations between lawmen and criminals were usually unpredictable, violent, and messy. Ambushes, sudden shootouts, and chaotic chases were the norm. Lawmen had to anticipate deception, act decisively under extreme stress, and often make life-or-death decisions in seconds. Their work demanded courage, yet it was far more dangerous and complex than the legends portray. Lawmen were also responsible for protecting vulnerable populations, including women, children, and settlers isolated in remote homesteads. Yet even these duties were perilous. Many crimes went unpunished simply because pursuing justice meant risking life and limb. A sheriff could respond to a call for help only to discover a murder had already occurred. The Wild West did not forgive hesitation, and the consequences of failure were immediate and often tragic. Corruption intertwined with heroism in complex ways. Figures like Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, and Bat Masterson became legends not only for their courage but also for navigating the ambiguous moral terrain of the frontier. They upheld the law where possible but sometimes compromised it strategically, balancing survival, public perception, and practical necessity. The boundary between right and wrong was blurred, and the lawmen who survived the frontier were those who could operate effectively within its shadows. The justice system's limitations also fueled cycles of revenge. Outlaws sought retribution against lawmen who arrested or pursued them, while families of victims often took the law into their own hands. Feuds could last for years, escalating violence and undermining community stability. In this world, survival often depended more on shrewd judgment and calculated action than on morality or virtue. Ultimately, the reality of lawmen in the Wild West reveals a world far removed from simple heroism. The law was fragile, enforcement inconsistent, and corruption pervasive. Towns depended on lawmen for protection, yet those same lawmen had to navigate an environment of greed, danger, and moral ambiguity. Survival required not just courage and skill but also pragmatism, intuition, and a willingness to operate in gray areas where justice and corruption overlapped. The story of lawmen reminds us that the Wild West was not a tidy world of heroes and villains. It was a chaotic, unpredictable environment where the law existed as both a tool and a limitation. The men and women enforcing justice walked a razor's edge, balancing morality, survival, and the needs of their communities. Their legacy is a testament to the complexity, danger, and human frailty that defined frontier life, a world where courage was necessary, but it was never enough to guarantee safety or fairness. While tales of outlaws, gunfights, and lawmen dominate the mythology of the Wild West, the daily reality for most settlers was far less glamorous and far more grueling. Frontier towns were hubs of commerce, social interaction, and survival, but they were also places of constant danger, disease, and deprivation. The streets were bustling, yet precarious, where life and death coexisted, and every day demanded vigilance, endurance, and resilience. Most frontier towns were hastily built, often from wood planks salvaged from nearby forests or rail shipments. Buildings were close together, creating narrow, dusty streets that became mud baths during rains or clouds of choking dust in the summer. Saloons, general stores, blacksmith shops, and churches formed the skeleton of the town, but sanitation was virtually non-existent. Waste, refuse, and animals mingled freely, making disease outbreaks a persistent and deadly threat. Settlers lived, worked, and played amid flies, vermin, and filth, with minimal protection from infection. Commerce in these towns was as unpredictable as it was essential. General stores offered basic necessities, often at inflated prices, and goods were limited to what could be transported over long distances. Residents bartered, traded, and improvised constantly. For many families, survival depended on skillful negotiation, thrift, and resourcefulness. Every meal, piece of clothing, and tool carried the weight of hard labor and limited supply. Even minor setbacks, a failed harvest, a missed delivery, or theft, could have catastrophic consequences. Social life was both a refuge and a risk. Townsfolk gathered in saloons, churches, or public squares to exchange news, gossip, or small pleasures. Music, dancing, and games provided brief relief from hardship, yet these spaces were also breeding grounds for conflict. Alcohol-fueled arguments often escalated into fights, and disputes could turn deadly with a gun or knife. Even socializing required caution, a friendly face could quickly become a threat. Children experienced frontier life differently, yet no less harshly. Education was limited, with one-room schoolhouses serving multiple grades, often taught by overworked and underprepared teachers. Work began early, children fetched water, tended animals, or helped in fields and workshops. Play was brief, often dangerous, and frequently interrupted by the demands of survival. Childhood was shorter and harsher than modern audiences might imagine, with lessons in endurance, responsibility, and practical skill learned at a very young age. Health and hygiene were constant challenges. Diseases like smallpox, cholera, influenza, and dysentery were common and deadly. Medical care was rudimentary, doctors were scarce, supplies limited, and knowledge minimal. Settlers relied on herbal remedies, midwives, or sheer luck, often facing death from infections that today would be easily treated. The ever-present threat of illness added tension to daily life, and communities were deeply affected by sudden outbreaks. Work in frontier towns was relentless. Men labored in construction, mining, ranching, or transport, while women handled domestic duties, childcare, and farm labor. Every household contributed to survival, and idleness was a luxury none could afford. Even in moments of rest, people remained alert. Attacks, accidents, and environmental hazards could strike without warning. Life demanded constant effort, endurance, and ingenuity. Religion and superstition played roles in shaping town culture. Churches offered spiritual guidance and a sense of community, while folk remedies, charms, and superstition filled gaps in medical knowledge. These beliefs provided comfort and structure in a world defined by chaos and unpredictability. Yet superstition could also lead to misguided decisions, from treatment of disease to judgment in disputes, reflecting the uncertainty and vulnerability inherent in frontier life. Communication with the outside world was slow and unreliable. Mail, telegraphs, and newspapers connected townsfolk to larger events, but delays were frequent. News traveled slowly, and rumors often filled the void, sometimes causing unnecessary panic or false hope. Families relied on letters and travelers to maintain bonds with distant relatives, making information precious and highly valued. Isolation intensified the psychological burden of frontier life. Crime and moral ambiguity were everyday realities. Theft, scams, and cheating were common, and settlers had to remain vigilant even among neighbors. Law enforcement was limited, meaning communities often enforced justice informally or through self-help. Vigilante justice was frequent, sometimes brutal, and often fueled by fear, revenge, or necessity. Settlers learned quickly that survival required not just labor and endurance but shrewd judgment and strategic caution. Despite these hardships, frontier towns were also places of resilience, innovation, and community. Residents adapted to extreme conditions, creating practical solutions for water, food, and shelter. Markets, schools, and social networks evolved to meet the challenges of daily life. Festivals, fairs, and public gatherings offered brief moments of joy, fostering a sense of identity and belonging. The towns were living testaments to human ingenuity, endurance, and the will to survive in a harsh, unpredictable environment. In essence, everyday life in frontier towns was a delicate balance of survival, social interaction, and adaptation. It was a world where comfort was fleeting, danger was omnipresent, and the boundaries between life and death were fragile. The day-to-day experiences of settlers were shaped by relentless labor, environmental hazards, disease, and the constant presence of moral and physical threats. Yet, amid the dust, hardship, and uncertainty, communities endured, demonstrating the resilience, creativity, and courage required to thrive in one of the harshest frontiers in history.